What if a single event changed the course of human history forever? Not just one civilization, but the future of every generation that followed. Hidden beneath layers of time are clues to a moment so extraordinary that it reshaped where people lived, how societies grew, and the world we know today. In this video, we'll uncover the evidence separate myth from reality and explore one of history's greatest turning points. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to The Archive Lost to History, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into humanity's forgotten past. Let's begin. The ground is still frozen in places where only a little farther south meltwater is beginning to run. Across the northern half of the world, ice lies over the land like a second sky brought down to earth, heavy enough to bend stone, deep enough to bury valleys, patient enough to grind mountains into powder. The air carries a hard brightness. Rivers do not always follow the courses they will keep in later ages. Coasts do not sit where modern maps expect them. Great plains stretch where seas will one day rise. Herds move through the open country in dark, restless lines, following grass, cold memory, and weather. Mammoths push through wind-blown steppe. Wild horses gather near shallow water. Reindeer, bison, aurochs, and giant deer move between patches of life in a world that is not empty but tense, immense, and unfinished. Human beings are there too, though they leave no cities, no kings' names, no carved histories of their own triumphs. They leave stone points, hearths, bones split for marrow pigments on cave walls, footprints pressed into mud, and the harder-to-see evidence of endurance. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the event that reshapes human history does not begin with an empire falling or a city burning. It begins in this older world under cold skies when survival depends on motion memory cooperation and the ability to read landscapes as if they are living texts. For most of human existence, people live without fields. That fact can be difficult to hold in mind because the modern world is built almost entirely on the opposite assumption. Bred rice cattle villages, borders stored grain taxes, inheritance permanent houses, crowded streets, written accounts, calendars of planting and harvest. Even the idea that land belongs to someone in a fixed and exclusive way, all of these rest on changes that come late in the human story. Before them, human communities move through territories shaped by seasons. They hunt, gather fish, trap, dig, burn, carry, remember, and return. Their lives are not simple. They know plants in astonishing detail, not as decoration, but as food, medicine, fiber, poison, glue, fuel, and signal. They know the habits of animals better than most later farmers ever will. They understand where water collects after storms, where tubers grow beneath poor-looking soil when migrating birds arrive, where stone suitable for blades can be found, and how a place changes when snow lasts longer than expected. What survives in the record suggests societies capable of art, ritual teaching, long-distance exchange, and symbolic thought. The evidence remains incomplete, but nothing about these people should be mistaken for a primitive failure. They are successful in the oldest human way. They keep going. The late Ice Age world is not one single frozen wasteland. It is a mosaic, and every region has its own rules. In Western Europe, open steppe and tundra-like grasslands spread under cold, dry conditions, with pockets of refuge where people and animals survive around rivers, caves, and sheltered valleys. In parts of Africa, climates shift in complex patterns, with lakes expanding and shrinking, deserts breathing outward and inward across thousands of years. In South and East Asia, monsoon systems alter the timing and abundance of water. In Australia, people have already lived through tens of thousands of years of changing environments, including drying landscapes and altered fire regimes. In the Americas, where the timing and routes of the earliest migrations remain debated in detail, human groups are moving through a continent of enormous ecological variety, from ice edge corridors and coastlines to grasslands filled with animals that will not survive much longer. Scholars still debate the exact pathways, dates, and rhythms of some migrations, but the larger picture is clear enough. By the end of the Pleistocene, humans are no longer a local species. They are a planetary presence scattered across different worlds under the same unstable sky. The ice itself is one of the great forces in this story. Vast ice sheets hold so much water that sea levels are far lower than they will be in the present. Land bridges and coastal plains exist where modern oceans now lie. Between Britain and the European mainland there is low land rivers, marshes and hunting ground. Between Siberia and Alaska, Beringia forms not merely a narrow bridge, but a broad region of steppe, cold and harsh, yet rich enough to sustain life. Around Southeast Asia, lowered seas expose a greater landmass, bringing islands and mainlands into different relationships. The map of the world is almost familiar, but not quite. Some of the most important human landscapes of this age are now drowned, hidden beneath shallow seas, buried under silt, sand and time. This matters because the past that archaeologists can study is only the part that has survived above water, or the part that chance has not erased. Whole coastlines where people may have lived, travelled, fished, and exchanged ideas are now missing from easy view. Human history begins with gaps. In this older world, food is not produced in the later agricultural sense. It is found, followed, captured, gathered, processed, and shared. Yet that does not mean people wander aimlessly. Many groups likely move according to known circuits, returning to places where experience has taught them resources will appear. A valley may be valuable because herds pass through at a certain season. A lakeshore may matter because birds nest there. A hillside may be remembered for nuts, berries, or edible roots. A cave may hold shelter, ritual, meaning, or both. Some places draw people back again and again for centuries, perhaps longer, long before anyone builds a permanent village there. Stone tools tell part of this story. The raw materials used for blades and points are sometimes carried across remarkable distances, showing that people move widely or connect with others who do. Shells, pigments, ornaments, and rare materials travel too, even without roads, markets, or writing. The world is threaded by contact. There is danger in imagining this life as either paradise or misery. It is neither. It contains hunger, injury, cold, grief, and sudden death. It also contains skill, freedom of movement, deep ecological knowledge, and social forms that leave few visible ruins. Bodies from later farming societies often show stress of a different kind, but that does not mean every forager life is easy or equal. The record is too scattered for such neat conclusions. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety of human experience before agriculture. Some groups may live relatively well in rich environments, especially along coasts, rivers, wetlands, or seasonal migration routes. Others face lean seasons where every decision matters. A failed hunt can mean hardship. A storm arriving early can close a pass. A herd changing direction can alter the fate of a band. Children learn not from books but from watching hands track smoke, stars, water, and the body language of animals. Old people are libraries carrying maps that are not drawn on skin or bark but remembered in movement. Then slowly at first the world begins to change. The last glacial maximum has passed. Ice still dominates the north, but its grip is weakening. Temperatures rise unevenly. Plants advance into ground once too cold for them. Forests begin to creep across former open landscapes. Meltwater pours from ice sheets, carving channels, swelling lakes, feeding rivers, that may roar with seasonal violence. Animals follow the changing vegetation, and people follow both. The entire living world starts to rearrange itself. To a human group moving through this transition, the change may not feel like a single event. It may feel like a grandfather's memory no longer matching the land exactly. It may feel like certain animals becoming harder to find, certain plants appearing in new places, certain trails becoming wet, certain winter shelters less reliable. It may feel like opportunity in one generation and loss in another. This is where the hidden beginning of the great transformation lies. Not in one brilliant invention, not in a sudden decision to become farmers, but in the pressure of a world becoming unfamiliar. The late Ice Age does not simply end like a door closing. It breaks apart in pulses, reversals, floods, warmings, and cold returns. People adapt as they always have, but adaptation has consequences. Staying longer near dependable resources changes social life. Storing food changes planning. Returning to stands of wild grain changes attention. Protecting a patch of useful plants changes the relationship between people and place. Watching animals gather near human camps changes the distance between hunter and herd. At first, none of this has to be called agriculture. It is simply survival becoming more deliberate. And still beneath all of it, the older world continues for a while, smoke rising from temporary camps, stone edges being struck from prepared cores, hides stretched and scraped bones cracked, stories carried across firelight, children walking behind adults through grass tall enough to hide danger. The people of this world do not know they stand before one of the greatest turns in human history. They do not know that their descendants will build villages, then towns, then cities, then states that count grain and command labor. They do not know that the relationship between humans and the earth is about to change so profoundly that later generations will mistake it for destiny. All they know is that the ice is retreating, the animals are moving, the seasons are shifting, and the familiar world is beginning very quietly to loosen beneath their feet. As the cold world begins to soften, the change does not arrive as a gentle blessing spread evenly across the earth. It moves unevenly like light entering a ruined hall through cracks in the roof. In one region, the snow line climbs higher, and plants return to ground that had been bare for generations. In another, melting ice feeds torrents so powerful that they carve new channels and leave behind fields of stone. Far away rainfall patterns shift in ways no human memory can predict, turning some basins greener while drying others into harsher country. The old Ice Age order, with all its dangers and all its dependable rhythms, begins to lose its shape. For people living inside this transition, the world is not simply warming, it is becoming less familiar. That difference matters because human societies are not shaped only by average temperature or rainfall. They are shaped by trust in the return of things, the return of herds, the return of plants, the return of fish runs, the return of weather that elders say should come at a certain time. When those returns falter, the mind of a community changes before its tools do. In some places, warming opens the landscape. Ice retreats from valleys and uplands, leaving behind raw ground, meltwater lakes, exposed stone, and new corridors for animals and people. Plants begin the long work of recolonization. First come hardy species that tolerate poor soils and unstable conditions. Later, shrubs and trees follow where warmth and moisture allow. What had once been open steppe may become parkland, then woodland. That sounds like abundance, and sometimes it is. Forests offer nuts, fruits, tubers, birds, small game wood bark and shelter. Wetlands offer fish reeds, waterfowl eggs and edible plants. Rivers become lines of attraction across the changing map. Yet each new environment also asks for different skills. A hunter trained to watch herds over open plains must learn the broken visibility of woodland. A group that once followed large animals across broad country may find movement slowed by trees, marshes, and altered river crossings. A spear point suited to one kind of prey may be less useful when the prey itself changes. Adaptation is not simply improvement. It is the replacement of one difficult knowledge with another. The animals feel the change in their own way, though not consciously, as history. The great cold-adapted grazers depend on wide grasslands and seasonal movement. As vegetation zones shift, their ranges alter. Some herds move north, some fragment, some decline. Other species expand into new country. Red deer boar, smaller woodland animals, birds, and fish become more important in many human diets, where forests and wetlands spread. This shift can be traced in bones left behind at archaeological sites, though the evidence remains incomplete and often local. A place that once contains many remains of large herd animals may later show more varied hunting and gathering with fish bones, bird bones, shellfish, plant remains, grinding stones, and tools for processing many kinds of food. It is a quieter evolution than the later rise of farming, but it prepares the ground. People are learning to draw life from smaller, more diverse resources. They are becoming more attentive to particular patches of land and water, not just to the wide movement of herds across distance. Along coastlines, the transformation is even more complicated because many of the coasts of that time no longer exist. Lower Ice Age sea levels had exposed plains, estuaries, river mouths, and island chains that are now drowned. As glaciers melt, the sea begins to rise slowly by the measure of a single year, but relentlessly across generations. A campsite near a rich shoreline may become a place closest to the tide, then a place threatened by storms, then a memory beneath water. Families may move inland or follow the retreating edge of the coast. Estuaries shift. Shellfish beds migrate. Fishing grounds alter. The record of these lives is now hidden beneath sediments, which means that archaeologists see only fragments of what must have been a major part of human adaptation. The missing coastlines are not empty spaces in history. They are likely to have been among the most attractive places to live, especially where rivers met the sea and food came from many directions at once. Their disappearance leaves human history with a drowned margin. This rising water changes the shape of human movement. Land bridges begin to narrow or vanish. Islands become isolated. Valleys fill. Low plains turn into marshes and then bays. In some regions, people may have watched familiar ground disappear during the lifetime of remembered ancestors. No single flood covers the whole world at once, despite later myths and popular images, but many local and regional inundations are real enough. A people living near a basin, a river mouth, or a shallow continental shelf does not need a global catastrophe to experience the end of a world. A few meters of sea level rise arriving across generations can erase hunting grounds, burial places, paths, and stories attached to land. What survives in the record suggests that humans repeatedly adapted to moving boundaries between land and water, yet the emotional cost of such changes can only be inferred. Archaeology can measure shells, sediments, and submerged forests. It cannot easily recover the feeling of leaving a place that had always been known. Further inland meltwater creates its own unstable geography. Ice-dammed lakes form along the edges of retreating glaciers, held back by walls of ice debris or frozen ground. Some last for long periods. Others fail, suddenly releasing enormous floods that tear through valleys and plains. These events are not the same everywhere, and scholars still debate the details and consequences of some ancient flood systems. But there is no doubt that deglaciation produces dramatic hydrological change. Rivers fed by ice can swell beyond ordinary patterns. Lakes can appear where dry ground once lay. Wetlands can expand, drawing birds, fish, and humans. Then, as drainage patterns shift again, these same places may dry or empty. For mobile groups, such volatility can be both gift and threat. A new lake may become a seasonal centre of life. A drained basin may force people elsewhere. The map becomes less like a fixed background and more like a moving creature. In Southwest Asia, the warming world creates conditions that will later become central to the rise of agriculture, though no one living there yet sees that future. Across parts of the Levant, Anatolia, and surrounding regions, wild cereals grow in dense stands where rainfall soils and seasonality allow. Wild barley, wheat, and other grasses offer concentrated food, but they also demand knowledge and labour. Their seeds ripen in narrow windows. They must be gathered, transported, dried, stored, ground, cooked and protected from insects, moisture and animals. Even before domestication, such plants encourage repeated visits to the same places. A group that knows where grain ripens may return year after year. A group that returns year after year may begin clearing, tending, burning, or protecting useful stands. These steps can remain within foraging life for a long time. They do not require fields in the later sense, but they begin to draw human attention toward the life cycle of plants in a more intimate way. The warming climate also allows some human communities to become less mobile, at least seasonally. Where resources are rich and varied, people can stay longer. A place with nearby grain, gazelle, nuts, waterfish and stone may support repeated occupation. Staying longer changes almost everything. Houses or huts become more substantial. Storage pits matter more. Grinding tools grow heavier because they no longer need to be carried far. Burials may take place close to living spaces, tying memory to location. Social bonds can become more anchored in place. Disputes may become harder to solve by simply moving away. Food sharing, ownership, ritual and status may all shift when people return, again and again, to the same ground. The evidence remains uneven, but the pattern is striking before full agriculture. Some communities already experiment with a more settled life, especially where environmental abundance allows it. Sedentism does not wait politely for farming to appear. In some places it comes first. This is one of the surprising details often missed in simple versions of the story. Farming is not invented one day by people who have suddenly grown tired of hunting and gathering. The path toward agriculture is long, hesitant, and reversible. People gather wild grain for generations before grain becomes domesticated. They live in villages before they rely entirely on crops. They manage landscapes before they create formal fields. They may cultivate some plants while still hunting intensively. They may abandon cultivation when conditions worsen. The boundary between foraging and farming is not a wall. It is a broad shifting zone of choices, experiments, accidents, and pressures. No single explanation fully accounts for why some communities cross that zone while others do not. Climate creates opportunities and stresses, but people respond through culture, memory, desire, risk, and necessity. As the world warms, there is also a subtle change in time itself. Hunter-gatherer life has always required planning, but the new conditions encourage different kinds of planning. Stored foods link one season to the next. Semi-permanent houses link one generation to a place. Burials link ancestors to land. Plant-tending links present labour to future harvest. These changes create a deeper investment in tomorrow, and tomorrow begins to weigh more heavily on today. In this sense, the climate turn does more than melt ice and raise seas. It stretches human expectation. It makes some groups think more about delayed returns, defended places, and accumulated surplus. The event that reshapes human history is still not fully visible. It is gathering quietly in habits that might seem ordinary, cutting stems, drying seeds, repairing a hut, returning to a spring, remembering that last year's plants grew thicker where the ground had been disturbed. Yet the warming world is unstable, and this instability is the key to what comes next. Just as people begin adapting to new environments, just as plants and animals shift into new ranges, just as some communities settle more deeply into particular landscapes, the planet does something deeply unsettling. The long thaw falters. The path out of the Ice Age bends sharply. In parts of the northern hemisphere, warmth gives way again to cold, and the fragile trust built during the first stages of change is broken. The old world has loosened, but the new one has not yet secured itself. People stand between climates, between ways of life, between mobility and settlement, between wild harvest and cultivation. Then the cold returns, sudden enough to be remembered by the earth itself, and the experiment of human adaptation is forced into a harsher form. The return of cold arrives not as a simple winter, nor as a brief season of hardship, but as a climatic reversal, large enough to leave its signature in ice-mud pollen lake beds and the memory of landscapes. After thousands of years of warming, when forests have begun to spread and meltwater has remade rivers, the northern hemisphere enters a strange interruption. Temperatures fall, rainfall patterns shift, winds change. In some regions, the growing season shortens, and the plants that had advanced into new territory retreat or struggle. The world that seemed to be moving toward warmth suddenly hesitates, then turns backward. Modern science calls this period the Younger Dryas, a name taken from a hardy Arctic flower whose pollen appears in European sediments, signaling the return of colder conditions. But for the people living through it, there is no name that survives. There is only the experience of a world becoming unreliable again, after it had already asked them to adapt once. The Younger Dryas begins roughly 12,900 years ago, and lasts for more than 1,000 years, though its effects are not the same everywhere. That unevenness matters. It is not a global freeze in the simple sense, and it should not be imagined as the whole Earth suddenly buried under ice. Some regions cool dramatically, especially around the North Atlantic. Other regions feel the change through altered rainfall, stronger seasonality drought, or ecological disruption. In parts of Southwest Asia, where later agriculture will take root, the climate becomes cooler and drier, in ways that may have placed real pressure on communities already experimenting with more settled life. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how local environments responded, but the broader pattern is clear, just as humans, plants, and animals are adjusting to post-Ice Age warmth. The climate system jolts them into a harsher and more uncertain age. The cause of this reversal remains one of the great scientific puzzles of late Ice Age history, though several strong possibilities exist. A leading explanation involves enormous volumes of meltwater, from retreating ice sheets entering the North Atlantic or Arctic drainage systems disrupting ocean circulation, that helps move heat through the planet. When fresh water pours into salty ocean water, it can interfere with the sinking and movement of dense currents, weakening the great conveyor of warmth that affects climates around the Atlantic world. The exact routes, timing, and scale of this freshwater pulse remain debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern. Other factors may have contributed, and some popular theories propose a cosmic impact or airburst as a trigger, but those claims remain disputed and are not accepted as the simplest explanation by many researchers. What survives most firmly in the scientific record is the climate shock itself, abrupt, powerful, and deeply consequential. To understand how unsettling this would have been, it helps to imagine not a single catastrophe, but a betrayal of patterns. The people of this age do not rely on written calendars, Yet they live by detailed seasonal expectations. They know when certain plants ripen, when animals move, when rain should come, when cold becomes dangerous, when rivers swell, when a place becomes worth visiting, and when it becomes empty. A sudden climate reversal attacks that knowledge. The old Ice Age knowledge may no longer work because the world has already changed. The newer Warming Age knowledge may now fail because warmth has retreated. Communities are caught between two versions of the Earth, neither fully dependable. A group that had begun staying longer near wild grain fields may find yields reduced. A group that had shifted toward woodland resources may see those forests thin or reorganize. Hunters may track animals whose ranges are moving again. Gatherers may search for plants that ripen late, fail or vanish from familiar ground. In Europe, the pollen record shows the return or expansion of cold-tolerant vegetation in some places, with open landscapes reappearing where trees had gained ground. Glacial and periglacial conditions strengthen in northern regions. For human groups, this may mean renewed reliance on mobility hunting and flexible use of broad territories. But Europe is only one part of the story. In the Levant and surrounding areas where the Natufian culture had already developed more settled foraging communities before full agriculture the Younger, Dryas may have produced a different kind of pressure. Some Natufian sites show substantial dwellings, grinding stones, storage practices, burials, and strong ties to place. These are not cities and not farms in the later sense, but they represent something unusual, foragers living with a degree of settlement that would have been difficult in poorer environments. When climate becomes cooler and drier, the resources supporting that life may become less predictable. People who have invested in place may face a sharper dilemma than people who can more easily move. This is one of the central tensions of the story. Mobility is a powerful form of resilience. If one valley fails, a group can leave. If a herd shifts, hunters can follow. If plant foods become scarce, people can widen their seasonal range. But settlement creates advantages that mobility does not: storage, stronger shelters, social gathering, ritual continuity, and the ability to intensively use local resources. Once a community begins to store food, bury its dead near homes, build repeated structures, and return to the same fields of wild grain, movement becomes more costly. The land is no longer just a place visited in a seasonal round. It begins to hold memory, labor, and identity. The Younger Dryas presses hardest on precisely this new relationship between people and place. It does not simply make food scarcer. It makes staying and leaving both more complicated. The archaeological record from this period is fragmentary, but it reveals hints of stress adjustment and experimentation. Some settlements shrink or are abandoned. Some communities appear to become more mobile again. Others may intensify their use of particular foods, including wild cereals, legumes, nuts, and small animals. Grinding stones and sickle blades suggest that plant processing remains important, though their meaning depends on context. A tool can show that seeds were cut or ground. It cannot easily reveal whether the people using it felt desperation, confidence, routine, or innovation. Charred plant remains can show which species were present. They cannot fully explain why one food became central while another declined. Archaeology often speaks in traces, not full sentences. Still, the pattern suggests that the Younger Dryas did not simply destroy old ways, it forced choices. And some of those choices moved human societies closer to cultivation. A lesser-known and fascinating detail lies in the plants themselves. Wild cereals naturally scatter their seeds when ripe, a useful trait for the plant, but an inconvenience for humans trying to harvest them. Early gatherers likely learned the timing of ripening with great precision, cutting or collecting seeds before they fell. Over time, when humans repeatedly harvest and perhaps sow or encourage certain stands, they may unintentionally favour plants whose seeds stay attached longer. Later domesticated cereals develop non-shattering seed heads, meaning the grain remains on the stalk until humans harvest it. This change is one of the biological fingerprints of domestication. It does not appear instantly, and it does not prove that people set out with a grand plan to transform nature. It shows something subtler and more powerful. Repeated human behaviour can alter the evolution of plants. A climate shock may have increased the importance of such behaviour, pushing communities to depend more heavily on foods they could predict, manage, and eventually reshape. Yet caution is necessary. It is too simple to say the Younger Dryas caused farming by itself. Agriculture appears in different parts of the world at different times, with different crops, animals, environments, and social histories. Wheat and barley in Southwest Asia, rice in parts of East Asia, maize in Mesoamerica, potatoes and quinoa in the Andes, millet in northern China, sorghum and other crops in Africa, and many additional domesticates follow their own long paths. Climate stress is part of the picture, but not the whole picture. Human choice, cultural tradition, population density, ecological opportunity, ritual, life trade technology, and accident all matter. Scholars still debate how much weight to give each factor. The Younger Dryas is best understood not as a single switch that turns foragers into farmers, but as a shock at a critical moment, especially in regions already poised between mobility and settlement, wild harvest and cultivation. The strange power of this cold return is that it arrives after possibility has already opened. If the Ice Age had simply continued, the story would be different. If warming had continued smoothly, the story would also be different. Instead, humans experience a broken transition, warmth, opportunity, settlement, then renewed cold and dryness in key regions. This sequence may have created a world in which some communities could remember abundance, but no longer trust it. They had learned that certain places were rich, that wild grains could support longer stays, that storage could carry food across seasons, that repeated occupation could create social worlds rooted in land. Then the climate made those same resources less dependable. The response was not immediate farming as a neat invention, but intensified attention. Seeds mattered more, storage mattered more, territory mattered more, the future mattered more. By the end of the Younger Dryas, the climate warms again, and this time the path leads into the Holocene, the relatively stable warm period in which recorded civilization will eventually arise. But the people emerging from the cold reversal are not the same as those who entered it. Their tool settlements, food strategies, and relationships to place have changed. They have lived through a period when the Earth systems revealed their volatility, when survival required both old mobility and new forms of control. The event that reshapes human history is not only the cold itself, but the human answer to it. In the pressure between climate instability and the desire for dependable food, a new way of living begins to gather force. The ice has not returned fully, but the warning has been delivered. Nature can change faster than memory, and in that gap between memory and survival, people begin to remake the world around them. When the cold reversal tightens its grip, the pressure does not fall on human communities in a single dramatic blow. It gathers in small failures, each one ordinary enough to be explained away, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. A stand of wild grain ripens thinner than before. A spring that once lasted into the dry months weakens earlier. Gazelle herds pass through at the wrong time, or in smaller numbers, or along routes that no longer bring them close to camp. Nuts are fewer after a poor season. Fish runs shift. Wood becomes harder to gather in places where shrubs retreat and open country returns. The landscape still offers life, but it offers it less predictably, and unpredictability is one of the oldest enemies of settled hope. For mobile foragers, hunger has always been answered partly by movement. But for people who've begun to live longer in certain favoured places, the question becomes sharper. A community cannot easily carry a heavy grinding stone, a storage pit, a repaired house floor, or the graves of its dead across the hills. This is the world under pressure, not destroyed, not empty, but strained. The old idea that climate change simply forces people to migrate or innovate is too blunt. Real human decisions are slower and more tangled. A group may first try to widen its diet, gathering more small seeds, digging more roots, trapping more small animals, hunting birds, collecting shellfish, or harvesting plants that had once been secondary foods. Another group may extend its seasonal range, sending hunters farther or splitting into smaller parties for part of the year. Another may double down on a productive location, defending access to a spring, a stand of cereals, a migration path, or a patch of woodland. What survives in the record suggests that late Pleistocene and early Holocene communities often respond with flexibility rather than one sudden transformation. Yet, flexibility has limits. The more people invest in a place, the more the place begins to demand commitment in return. In the Levant, this tension becomes especially visible because some communities already live in a way that blurs the line between foraging and farming. The Natufian world, stretching roughly across parts of modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, is not a civilization in the later sense. It has no writing, no palaces, no kings preserved in stone, but it has something that matters: deeply repeated settlement. At some Natufian sites, people build semi-subterranean houses with stone foundations. They use grinding stones, mortars, pestles, and sickle blades. They bury the dead with care, sometimes within or near living areas. They collect wild cereals and hunt gazelle. They use ornaments made from shells, bone, and stone. Some materials move over distance, showing networks that connect communities across varied landscapes. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how sedentary all Natufian groups were, but the pattern is clear enough to disturb older assumptions. People begin gathering into durable places before domesticated crops fully exist. That order matters. For a long time, simple stories imagined farming first, villages second. But in parts of Southwest Asia, the sequence appears more complicated. Rich environments may allow certain foragers to stay in one place for longer periods, at least seasonally and perhaps year-round in some locations. Once people stay new, problems appear. Food must be stored because local abundance does not arrive every day. Houses must be maintained. Waste accumulates. Social tensions have to be managed among people who cannot simply drift apart without consequence. Children grow up knowing a particular place as home, rather than one stop in a wider circuit. Elders become attached to the ground where ancestors are buried. The camp is no longer just a temporary arrangement of bodies around fire. It becomes a centre of memory. And when climate stress arrives, memory can become both strength and trap. Food pressure leaves subtle marks. Archaeologists sometimes see broader diets during stressful periods, a pattern often called broad-spectrum foraging. This does not mean people are starving at every moment. It means they're drawing on a wider array of resources, including foods that require more labour for each measure of energy gained. Small seeds, for example, can feed people, but collecting and processing them can be demanding. They must be gathered in quantity, cleaned, ground, and cooked. Roots and tubers may require digging and detoxifying. Small animals require traps, nets, or careful pursuit. Birds, fish, and shellfish can be abundant in the right environments, but they demand their own technologies and timing. The shift towards such resources can reveal intelligence and adaptability, not decline. Still, it also shows that people are working more intensively with the land, extracting food from more corners of the environment. under pressure, the landscape becomes more closely read. Water is central to this pressure. In a cooler and drier phase, especially in regions already balanced between woodland steppe and semi-arid zones, water sources become anchors of life. Spring streams, marshes, and seasonal pools can determine where people gather and how long they remain. Around reliable water, plants grow thicker and animals return. Around unreliable water, settlement becomes risky. A village-like community may survive not simply because it has grain nearby, but because it sits within reach of multiple resources: water, wild cereals, hunting routes, fuel, building material, stone, and social partners. Remove one part of that web and life becomes harder. Remove several, and the settlement may fail. No single explanation fully accounts for why some places are abandoned while others persist, but the combination of climate stress and local ecology can make the difference between continuity and dispersal. Another pressure comes from people themselves. If favourable zones shrink or become more uneven, groups may find themselves closer to one another, competing or cooperating around dependable resources. Population pressure in prehistory is difficult to measure, and it should not be imagined like modern overcrowding. The numbers are much smaller, but even small increases matter when food is seasonal and territory carries memory. A valley that supports several groups in good years may become tense in bad ones. Exchange networks can help, allowing food tools, mates, knowledge, and ritual ties to move between communities. Yet exchange can also mark inequality or obligation. The more fixed a community becomes, the more valuable its location may appear to others. The roots of later property, territory, and social boundary do not appear all at once, but this is one of the deep places where they may begin to thicken. The pressure also changes technology, not always through spectacular invention, but through refinement. Grinding stones become more important where seeds and nuts are heavily processed. Sickle blades show polish from cutting grasses. Storage features suggest concern with surplus and shortage. Basketry, cordage, nets, mats, and containers must have been crucial, though they rarely survive unless conditions are unusually dry, wet, or protected. This creates a distortion in the record. Stone tools last, fibre tools vanish. Archaeology may therefore make these people look more stone-centered than they were. In reality, much of daily survival likely depends on perishable technologies: woven bags for carrying grain, baskets for storage, nets for fish and birds, cords for traps, mats for floors, wooden digging sticks, hide containers, and plant fibre clothing. The most important tools of a changing world may be the ones that usually disappear. There is another stranger consequence of staying close to resources under stress. The boundary between wild and human-shaped landscapes begins to blur. People have always altered environments. Fire hunting, trampling, digging, cutting, and carrying seeds can change plant communities long before agriculture. A camp used repeatedly becomes ecologically different from surrounding land. Waste enriches soil. Disturbed ground favours certain plants. Seeds dropped near habitation may sprout. Harvesting may encourage denser growth in some patches and reduce it in others. People may not think of this as cultivation at first. They may simply notice that useful plants appear more often where humans have disturbed the earth. They may protect those plants, clear competitors, or return at harvest time. The evidence for such early management can be hard to separate from natural processes, and scholars still debate the timing of deliberate cultivation in many places. But the principle is powerful. Human presence itself becomes an ecological force. Under these pressures, daily life gains a new rhythm. Dawn may bring not only the search for food, but the maintenance of stored food. People check pits, baskets, skins, and drying racks. They watch for rodents, moisture, insects, and mold. They repair walls and hearths. They process seeds with repeated motions that wear grooves into stone and strength into hands. Children learn which grains are worth gathering and how to separate edible parts from chaff. Hunters still move out because farming has not yet arrived as a replacement, but the balance of attention shifts. Food is no longer only pursued across the land. Some of it is watched, guarded, dried, hidden, and remembered in place. This kind of life may offer security, but it also creates vulnerability. Stored food can be stolen. A failed local harvest can be devastating. Staying near one place increases exposure to waste parasites and conflict. Every solution carries its shadow. The wider landscape reflects this same uncertainty. Some places become refuges, drawing people, animals, and plants into concentrated zones. Others lose their value and fade from use. A site abandoned in the archaeological record may represent disaster, but it may also represent a sensible decision to resume mobility. A site occupied continuously may represent success but also constraint. The record does not speak in moral categories. It preserves outcomes, not always intentions. What survives suggests that communities during and after the cold reversal do not march uniformly toward farming. They experiment. Some move away from settlement, some remain. Some intensify plant use, some rely more on hunting. Some combine all of these strategies across seasons and generations. The path is uneven because human beings are not solving an abstract problem. They are living inside particular valleys, hills, river mouths, and memories, and yet from this unevenness a direction begins to emerge. The pressure of altered landscapes makes dependable food more valuable. The experience of semi-settled life makes place more meaningful. The use of storage makes the future more present. The repeated gathering of wild grains makes plant life cycles more closely observed. The need to manage risk makes experimentation more likely. None of these alone creates agriculture. Together over time they prepare the mind, the hand, and the landscape for it. The event that reshapes human history is not simply the younger Dryas's climate, but the way climate pressure acts on communities already standing at a threshold. The world narrows in some places, and in that narrowing people look more carefully at seeds, water animals, and ground. The old freedom of movement does not vanish, but another possibility begins to take root beside it, the possibility that survival might come not only from following the world but from changing it. At the edge of this changing world, human life begins to take on a form that would have seemed unusual to many earlier generations. The people are still foragers. They still hunt gazelle, deer, boar, birds, and small animals. They still gather nuts, fruits, roots, seeds, and herbs. They still know the wider land beyond their settlements, and they still depend on movement when the season demands it. Yet some communities now live with a new weight around them, a weight made of stone walls, packed floors, stored food, repeated burials, and paths worn by feet, returning to the same place again and again. These people are not yet farmers in the full sense, but they're no longer simply passing through the land. They stand at a threshold where old mobility and new settlement overlap, and the tension between them becomes one of the most important forces in human history. In Southwest Asia, especially in the Levant, the Natufian communities reveal this threshold with unusual clarity. Their settlements are often modest by later standards, but their significance is enormous. Circular or oval structures, sometimes partly dug into the earth, appear in clusters. Stone foundations hold walls that may once have supported brushwood hide or reed superstructures. Hearths mark repeated domestic activity. Heavy grinding stones lie where they were used too cumbersome for a life of constant movement. Burials are placed near or beneath habitation areas, binding the living and the dead into the same ground. Ornaments made from shells and bone show care for appearance, identity, and perhaps status. The archaeological record does not preserve every gesture, every meal, or every belief, but what survives suggests communities with strong social memory, practical skill, and a growing attachment to place. This attachment is not sentimental in any simple way. It is built through labour. A place becomes important because people work it, repair it, return to it, store food in it, bury kin within it, and teach children how to live around it. The more a community invests in a settlement, the more the settlement changes the community. A temporary camp allows a kind of flexibility that a village-like place does not. When conflict rises, a family can move. When refuse accumulates, the group can shift camp. When resources fail, the territory can be widened. But when houses stand, when tools are heavy, when storage pits hold the next season's security departure, becomes more costly. Settlement creates a new kind of courage and also a new kind of fear. People gain the possibility of stability, but they also become vulnerable to the failure of a local world. The Natufian world is especially fascinating because it appears before clear domesticated cereals dominate. That means people are experimenting socially before biology has fully changed. Wild grains remain wild. Gazelle remain wild. The landscape is not yet divided into fields and pastures. Yet the human pattern is already shifting. Some sites suggest longer occupation, perhaps even year-round residence in favourable areas, while others may have been used seasonally. Scholars still debate the degree of sedentism at different sites, and the evidence remains incomplete because organic materials decay, sites erode, and later occupations disturb earlier layers. Still, the broad pattern is difficult to ignore. People are gathering in more durable communities, and those communities create new possibilities for cooperation, ritual storage, and social difference. One lesser-known detail is that dogs appear in some late Pleistocene and early Holocene contexts as part of this changing human world. The domestication of dogs likely began earlier than agriculture, though the exact timing and process remain debated. At certain Natufian sites, burials involving humans and dogs suggest a relationship already far beyond casual contact. This matters because the dog is not a food plant and not a herd animal in the later agricultural sense. It represents another way humans begin to reshape relationships with other species. Dogs may have helped with hunting, protection, cleaning waste, or companionship, but they also reveal something deeper. Before humans domesticate fields, they are already forming durable bonds with animals around camp settlements and shared survival. The New World is not only about grain, it is about proximity. At the edge of settlement, daily life becomes denser. More people may spend longer periods together, which changes social pressure. In a highly mobile band, conflict can sometimes be eased by distance. In a settled community, resentment has nowhere easy to go. Cooperation must become more structured. Food sharing may be more carefully negotiated. Storage introduces difficult questions: who gathers, who guards, who receives, who decides when reserves are opened. A pit of stored grain or nuts is more than food. It is future power. A family with better access to storage labour or prime gathering areas may gain influence. The evidence for inequality in these early communities is subtle, and it would be wrong to imagine later class society already fully formed. But the seeds of difference may be present wherever surplus can be accumulated, defended, displayed, or inherited. Burial practices provide some of the most haunting clues. Human remains from Natufian sites show varied treatment. Some burials include ornaments. Some bodies are placed with care. In later Southwest Asian contexts, skull removal and plastered skulls appear suggesting complex relationships with ancestors, identity, and household memory. Not all of this belongs to the Natufian moment itself. and scholars still debate how to interpret these practices, but the broader movement is striking. As people settle, the dead become more fixed in the landscape. Ancestors are no longer only remembered in stories carried across distance. They can become physically present beneath floors, near walls, within the settlement's living space. This may strengthen claims to place. A house is not just shelter if generations are buried nearby. Land is not just useful if it holds the bones of kin. This new social closeness also changes ritual life. Communities that gather regularly in the same place can build shared spaces, repeat ceremonies, and coordinate labor in ways more difficult for highly dispersed groups. Ritual does not wait for kings, priests, or temples. It appears wherever humans gather to make meaning beyond immediate survival. The great ritual centers that later emerge in parts of Anatolia, including monumental sites that predate or accompany early farming communities, remind us that symbolic life is not a decoration added after food production. In some cases, shared belief ceremony and gathering may have helped pull people towards settlement as much as food did. No single explanation fully accounts for why people begin living more closely together, but ritual memory and identity are likely part of the answer. At the same time, bodies begin to register the cost of this experiment. A more settled life can bring injuries associated with repetitive grinding, carrying, building, and processing food. Teeth may show heavy wear from grit in ground foods. Close living can increase exposure to waste and parasites. Smoke from hearths lingers around enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces. More permanent habitation attracts rodents and insects, especially where stored food is kept. These changes do not mean settled life is a mistake. They mean it is a bargain. Every new security produces a new hazard. The people standing at this threshold may gain reliable shelter and stored calories, but they also enter a world of heavier work, closer disease environments, and social obligations that are harder to escape. The pressure of the younger Dryas sharpens these bargains. A mobile group facing drought or reduced plant yields can move more widely, though movement itself may become dangerous if neighboring groups are also under pressure. A settled group can use storage and local knowledge to endure bad seasons, but if the surrounding resource base weakens, too much settlement becomes a trap. This may explain why some sites appear abandoned or reduced during harder climatic phases while others persist. People do not all choose the same path because their landscapes are not the same. Some valleys offer water when hills dry. Some uplands keep useful plants when lowlands fail. Some communities possess stronger exchange ties, better storage, or more flexible seasonal patterns. The story is not a straight line from hardship to farming. It is a web of local experiments, and only some of those experiments become the foundation of the agricultural world. Still, something profound is happening inside these experiments. People are learning to live with the future in a new way. Stored food turns tomorrow into an object of management. Houses turn place into inheritance. Burials turn memory into territory. Repeated harvesting turns wild plants into familiar partners. Dogs' camps waste seeds, hearths, and human footsteps create altered ecological zones around settlement. The more people stay, the more they change the place. The more the place changes, the more it invites them to stay. This feedback loop is quiet but powerful. It does not require anyone to imagine cities, kingdoms writing taxation, or empire. It only requires people to make practical decisions under uncertain conditions and to repeat them long enough for those decisions to reshape both landscape and society. By the time the cold reversal nears its end, the edge has become a zone of possibility. The old foraging world remains alive, skilled and resilient. It will not disappear everywhere, and in many regions it will continue successfully for thousands of years. But in certain places, especially where climate stress meets rich wild resources and growing settlement, human communities begin to move in a new direction. They are not marching toward progress in the simple sense. They are negotiating risk. They are trying to hold food closer, memory closer, animals closer, and one another closer. The event that reshapes human history works through this narrowing of distance. People at the edge of uncertainty begin to pull parts of the living world into their own orbit, and once that begins, the boundary between the human community and the wild landscape will never be quite the same again. The first settled places do not rise like cities. They do not announce themselves with walls high enough to impress an enemy, towers visible from far away, or monuments built to celebrate rulers. They appear more quietly as clusters of human persistence pressed into earth. A circle of stones, a floor packed hard by many feet, a hearth rebuilt in nearly the same place, a pit cut into the ground and lined for storage, a grave placed close enough to daily life that the dead remain part of the settlement's shape. From a distance, such places may have looked like little more than shelters gathered near water reeds, trees, and food. But in the deep history of human beings, they mark a change as dramatic as any palace or pyramid. They show that some communities have begun to do something new with time. They're no longer only returning to the land, they are beginning to remain. To remain is not a small act. It changes the body first. Paths become familiar under the feet. Hands repeat the same work in the same light at the same stones near the same hearths. Shoulders learn the weight of carrying water from a known source rather than moving camp toward the next one. Knees and backs bend over grinding slabs for long hours. Children grow up with landmarks that do not vanish after a season, a certain wall, a certain tree, a certain burial, a certain patch of ground where food is dried. Old people can point not only to a direction of travel, but to a house repaired by their parents, a floor under which kin have been placed, a slope where grain ripens, a spring that has failed only in the hardest years. What survives in the record suggests that settlement creates a deeper continuity between people and place, even before formal agriculture makes that continuity unavoidable. In Southwest Asia, some of these early places belong to the long transition from late Natufian life into the early Neolithic. Names such as Jericho, Abu Huraira, Mureybet, Netiv, Hagdud, and others appear in archaeological discussions not because they are identical, but because they preserve different fragments of a shared transformation. At some sites, people live in rounded structures before later rectangular architecture becomes common. At others, houses cluster in ways that suggest close domestic life. Storage, grinding, plant processing, and repeated rebuilding become increasingly important. The evidence remains incomplete, and each site has its own history, but the wider movement is unmistakable. Human communities are investing labor into places at a scale that changes the meaning of habitation. A shelter is no longer merely a place to survive weather. It becomes part of a social world. One of the most surprising details in this transition is how much of settled life appears before the full package of farming. Modern imagination often compresses the story into a simple sequence. People discover agriculture, then they build villages. But the archaeology resists that neat order. In several regions, settlement, storage, ritual gathering, and intensive plant use seem to emerge before crops are fully domesticated. This means people are not merely reacting to an invention. They are creating the conditions in which the invention becomes useful, perhaps even necessary. A heavy grinding stone matters more when it can stay in one place. A storage pit matters more when a community expects to return. A house matters more when people are coordinating labor around nearby resources. The village does not simply follow farming like a shadow. In some places, it helps call farming into being. The shape of these early settlements reflects a life balance between continuity and experiment. Circular houses are common in many early contexts, partly sunk into the ground, with stone or mud walls supporting lighter materials above. Their interiors may contain hearths, working areas, storage features, and floors renewed again and again. Later, rectangular houses become more widespread, and that change is more than architectural taste. Rectangular rooms can be joined, divided, expanded, and arranged into denser settlements more easily than round structures. The shift may reflect changes in household organization, property storage, and the practical pressures of living with more people in a fixed space. Scholars still debate the social meaning of this architectural change, but it hints at a deeper truth. As people settle, space itself becomes organized differently. Walls begin to guide relationships. Storage is one of the quiet engines of this new world. A group that stores food is making a claim against uncertainty. It gathers more than it needs immediately and protects that excess from rot theft, insects, rodents, and weather. Storage changes the emotional landscape of hunger. It allows people to survive a lean season, host gatherings, feed children during shortages, and remain in place when movement might once have been necessary. But storage also creates new social questions. A pile of grain or nuts can be counted hidden, guarded, promised stolen, inherited, or controlled. It can create obligation between households. It can elevate the careful planner, the successful gatherer, the family, with more labor or the person trusted to oversee communal reserves. No single explanation fully accounts for how inequality begins, and early villages should not be imagined as miniature kingdoms. Yet surplus gives social life a new material form. Food becomes not only nourishment, but leverage over time. Communal structures add another layer. In some early settlements and ritual centres, buildings appear that do not fit easily into ordinary domestic use. They may have served gathering ceremonies, feasts, storage, decision-making, or activities no longer visible in the surviving record. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, monumental stone enclosures with carved pillars appear in a period when people were still deeply connected to hunting and foraging, though the relationship between the site and surrounding settlement patterns remains debated. It would be misleading to treat such places as proof of a lost advanced civilization as popular speculation sometimes does. The evidence points instead to something more grounded and perhaps more astonishing. Communities without cities or kings could organize large-scale labor, create powerful symbolic spaces, and gather around shared meanings before agriculture had fully transformed daily life. Ritual and cooperation did not wait for the state. They belonged already to human societies capable of remarkable coordination. Feasting may have played a role in binding these communities together. A feast is not just a large meal. It is a social technology. It gathers people, displays generosity, settles obligations, creates alliances, marks ceremonies, and turns stored or hunted food into memory. In a world where settlement increases tension, feasting may help manage relationships between households and neighboring groups. It may also increase pressure to produce or gather surplus. To host, one must accumulate. To accumulate, one must plan. To plan, one must pay closer attention to seasonal abundance and future scarcity. The evidence for feasting in deep prehistory is often indirect, seen in concentrations of animal bones, special buildings, large vessels, or unusual deposits, and scholars still debate particular cases. But the logic is strong. Food does social work. Once people gather in larger numbers, food becomes one of the main ways society holds itself together. The dead also help hold these places together. Burials within settlements create a bond between household and ground that mobile life rarely expresses in the same way. In some early Neolithic communities, skulls are removed, curated, or plastered, creating images of ancestors whose presence may have mattered in household ritual. These practices are not uniform and should not be forced into one simple interpretation. They may speak of ancestor veneration, identity, mourning, territorial claims, social memory, or beliefs now beyond recovery. What matters for the larger story is that settled life draws the dead into architecture. Houses' floors and graves become part of one continuous space. A community that lives above its ancestors is not merely occupying land. It is thickening time beneath its feet. These villages are still vulnerable. Their walls do not protect against every shortage. Their stored food can fail. Their closeness can spread disease. Their reliance on local resources can become dangerous when climate swings or rainfall falters. Yet vulnerability does not erase the attraction of settlement. For many communities, the benefits are real: better storage, stronger social networks, richer, ritual life protection for children, accumulated tools, knowledge of local resources, and the ability to intensively use productive environments. A village can become a machine for remembering. It preserves paths, work areas, burial places, seasonal observations, and stories attached to one landscape. Once that machine exists, leaving it behind becomes harder than leaving a camp. By the time full agriculture begins to emerge more clearly, these settled places have already transformed human expectations. People have learned that a community can be built around repeated return, then around residence. They have learned that heavy tools, stored food, and shared structures can anchor life. They have learned that the same ground can hold work, memory, ancestors, ritual, and future plans. The world outside remains wild, alive, and essential, but the settlement creates a new center of gravity. The event that reshapes human history is taking physical form now, not yet as fields stretching to the horizon, but as small, dense knots of human commitment. In these early villages, the future city is not visible, but its deepest foundations are present. Food held in reserve, people gathered in place. Labor organized across time and memory buried under the floor. The seeds at the center of this story are small enough to vanish into dust, yet they carry one of the largest consequences in the human past. They are not impressive in the way bones of mammoths are impressive, or in the way stone monuments are impressive. A wild grain head bends in the wind, dries under the sun, and releases its seeds when the season tells it to scatter. To the plant, this is survival. To a hungry human hand, it is a timing problem. Gather too early, and the seed may not be fully ready. Gather too late, and the grain has already fallen to the ground, lost among stones, insects, birds, and soil. Somewhere in that delicate interval, people begin to pay closer attention. They watch ripening with the care of those who know that a few days can decide whether baskets fill or remain light. They cut stems, beat seed heads, carry bundles, dry harvests, grind kernels, and turn wild grass into food. Long before fields have borders, before ploughs cut soil, before anyone thinks of agriculture as a way of life, the human future begins to gather around the patient handling of seeds. Wild cereals are powerful foods because they concentrate energy in a form that can be stored. That storage is crucial. Many foods must be eaten quickly or processed heavily to last. Meat spoils, fruits rot. Some roots dry poorly or require careful preparation. Grain, if dried and protected, can wait. It can cross the dangerous space between one season and another. It can feed children after the harvest has passed. It can support people when hunting fails. It can make settlement more possible because stored food reduces the need to move immediately when local resources decline. But grain is never free. It demands labor at every step. It must be harvested at the right time, carried in bulk, threshed, winnowed, stored protected ground, mixed and cooked. A community that depends more heavily on grain is not choosing laziness or ease. It is choosing a different kind of hardship, one tied to repetition planning and the hope that stored abundance will outlast uncertainty. In the hills, valleys, and open woodlands of Southwest Asia, wild wheat, barley, rye, and other useful plants grow in patterns shaped by rainfall, soil fire, grazing, and disturbance. Some patches are naturally dense. Others become dense because human activity changes the local environment. Cutting plants, trampling ground, burning vegetation, discarding seeds, and returning waste to soil can all alter which species thrive near human settlement. At first, people may simply gather what grows. Then they may begin to encourage what is useful. They may clear competing plants around a productive stand. They may return seeds to promising ground. They may protect a patch from grazing animals. They may burn at particular times to renew growth. These acts are difficult to detect in the archaeological record because they leave faint traces compared with stone walls or bones. Scholars still debate exactly when deliberate cultivation begins in different places, but the larger process is clear. Before domestication is visible in plant anatomy, human attention is already reshaping the relationship between people and plants. The biology of domestication is one of the most remarkable parts of this transformation. Wild cereals usually have brittle stems or seed heads that shatter when ripe, scattering seeds naturally. Domesticated cereals tend to hold their seeds longer, making them easier for humans to harvest. This trait is not useful for the plant in the wild because seeds that never fall cannot spread effectively without help. But under human harvesting, it becomes useful in a new environment, the environment of people. If gatherers repeatedly collect from plants whose seeds remain attached, and if some of those seeds are later dropped, stored, or sown near human habitation, then over generations those traits can become more common. Domestication is not only a human invention imposed on nature, it is an evolutionary partnership, though an unequal one, in which human habits become a selective force. The field, even before it is fully a field, becomes a new kind of habitat. This process unfolds slowly. The first cultivators probably do not see themselves as crossing a historic boundary. They are not choosing between foraging and farming as if selecting from a menu of civilizations. They are solving practical problems with the tools of inherited knowledge. A patch of wild barley grows well near a settlement, so it is revisited. Seeds spilled near a storage area sprout, so the pattern is noticed. A disturbed slope yields thicker grain, so disturbance is repeated. A dry season reduces wild stands, so people experiment with placing seeds in more reliable soil. None of this requires a sudden revelation. It requires memory. It requires the ability to compare years. It requires elders who remember which patches survived drought children, who learn how ripe grain feels in the hand, and communities willing to invest labor before the return is guaranteed. Farming begins not as certainty but as a wager. The earliest cultivation also exists alongside hunting and gathering, not as an instant replacement. Gazelle hunting remains important in many areas. Nuts, fruits, legumes, roots, and wild greens continue to matter. Fish, birds, and small animals remain part of local economies where available. The idea of a pure farming community appearing all at once is misleading. For a long time, people likely balance cultivated or tended plants with wild resources. This mixed strategy makes sense. Early cultivation is risky. Crops can fail. Animals can eat young shoots. Rainfall can disappoint. Stored seeds can rot. Pests can invade. Labor invested in a field can be lost in a single bad season. Foragers know variety as insurance, and they do not abandon that wisdom easily. What changes is proportion and expectation. Slowly certain plants become not merely one resource among many, but the center around which more of life is organized. Tools reveal the weight of this change. Sickle blades acquire a distinctive sheen from cutting grasses. Grinding stones become worn through long use. Mortars and pestles show repeated pounding. Storage pits and bins speak of delayed consumption. Charred grains survive by accident when fire preserves what decay would otherwise destroy. Pollen and phytoliths, the tiny mineral traces plants leave behind, help reconstruct vegetation and plant use. None of these clues is complete on its own. A sickle blade can cut reeds as well as cereals. A grinding stone can process many foods. A charred seed may come from wild gathering or cultivation. Archaeologists must build the picture from many fragments, and the evidence remains incomplete. But when the fragments appear together across many sites and many generations, the direction becomes hard to miss. Human communities are becoming seed-centered in a way their ancestors were not. A lesser-known detail is that early domestication may have taken longer than once believed. Older models sometimes imagined a rapid agricultural revolution, as if domesticated crops appeared quickly after cultivation began. More recent evidence suggests a prolonged process in which domestication traits accumulated over centuries or even millennia. This means generations lived inside a grey zone where plants were being cultivated, but were not yet fully domesticated, where fields existed in some sense but still contained wild forms, where people were changing plants without fully controlling them. That slow pace makes the story more human. It means the transformation was carried by countless ordinary acts: selecting, cutting, storing, sowing, losing, trying again. The revolution was not a lightning strike. It was a habit repeated until biology changed. As seeds become more central, the calendar tightens around them. There is a time to prepare ground, a time to watch shoots, a time to guard ripening heads, a time to harvest, a time to dry, a time to grind, a time to save seed for the next cycle. This creates a new discipline of waiting. Mobile foragers also live by seasonal time, but cultivation ties people to future obligations in a different way. A community that sows must return. A community that stores seed must resist eating all of it. A community that depends on harvest must coordinate labor when the brief window arrives. The plant's life cycle becomes a social clock. Human time begins to bend around the growth of crops. With that clock comes a new relationship to land. A wild stand can be visited, but a cultivated patch asks to be defended. It carries labor already invested and food not yet harvested. That investment can sharpen territorial claims. It can change how neighbors negotiate access. It can make inheritance more meaningful because a patch improved by one generation may benefit the next. It can increase tension but also cooperation because harvesting large stands may require many hands working together. The field, even in its earliest form, becomes more than an ecological space. It becomes social space, remembered space, contested space, future space. The seeds of a new world therefore grow in two directions at once. They grow downward into soil, becoming plants altered by human hands. They grow outward into society, changing settlement, labor, memory, ownership, risk, diet, and ritual. No single explanation fully accounts for why this process becomes irreversible in some regions and not in others. Climate pressure matters, especially after the instability of the Younger Dryas. Rich wild resources matter. Sedentary life matters. Population and social gathering may matter. Human curiosity and accident matter too. But once communities begin relying more deeply on managed plants, a feedback loop starts to form. More crops support more people. More people require more crops. More labor improves the fields. Better fields encourage longer settlement. Longer settlement makes leaving harder. The seed becomes food. The food becomes village. The village becomes obligation. And obligation becomes history. By the time the Holocene warmth settles more firmly across many regions, the experiment has already changed its experimenters. People still hunt, they still gather, they still know wild landscapes, but some now carry a future in baskets of saved seed. They hold next year's survival in the dry kernels kept back from hunger. This is a profound psychological shift. Food is no longer only discovered in the world outside. Part of it is brought into being through human intention. The event that reshapes human history is therefore not only a climate shock or a warming planet. It is the moment when humans, pressured by instability and drawn by possibility, begin to trust their own repeated intervention in the lives of plants. From that trust, uncertain and fragile at first, the fields of the world slowly begin. Near the edges of early settlements, animals are watching humans as carefully as humans are watching them. Some come for discarded bones, spilled seeds, damp refuse, or the smaller creatures drawn to human waste. Some pass through familiar hunting grounds that now lie closer to houses, hearths, and storage pits. Some are pursued across open country as they always have been, their movements read from tracks, dung, broken stems, and the nervous behaviour of birds. Others begin to live in a new zone that is neither fully wild nor fully human, a borderland of smoke scraps, danger, and opportunity. The transformation of animals does not begin with fenced pastures and obedient herds. It begins around this blurred edge where fear and familiarity exist together, and where certain species under certain conditions can be drawn closer without disappearing. For most of human history, animals are not possessions in the later farming sense. They are beings with roots, habits, tempers, seasons, and powers. Hunters know them as prey, but also as patterns of knowledge. A gazelle herd is not only meat, it is a moving sign of rainfall, grass landscape, and time. Aurochs wild cattle are strength and danger made visible too large to treat casually. Wild sheep and goats move through rocky country, with a skill humans must study closely to follow. Boar root through woodland and wet ground, unpredictable and useful. Birds mark wetlands. Fish reveal the hidden life of rivers. People live among animals not as masters of nature, but as participants in a vast and shifting community of appetite. What survives in the record suggests that animal knowledge is one of the great intellectual achievements of foraging societies, though it is rarely honoured as such because it is not written down. The first major animal domestication link closely to humans is probably the dog, and its story begins before sheepfolds, cattle pens, or barns. Wolves and humans occupy overlapping worlds as social hunters. Both track prey, move in groups, communicate with subtle signals, and exploit the remains of kills. The process by which some wolves become dogs remains debated, with questions about timing, location, and whether domestication began once or multiple times. But the broad logic is persuasive. Less fearful wolves may have scavenged near human camps, while humans may have tolerated or encouraged animals that, warned of danger, helped locate prey, cleaned waste, or simply became familiar presences. Over generations, selection favoured animals able to live near people. The result was not merely a tamed wolf. It was a new relationship between species, one that changed both sides. A dog near the firelight is a sign that humans can draw another animal into their social world without yet becoming farmers. Other animals follow a different path. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs are not domesticated because they are friendly in any simple way. They become domesticable because their biology and social behaviour can, under pressure, be redirected into human systems. Wild sheep and goats live in herds with social structures that can be managed. They feed on landscapes humans can access and later guide. They produce meat, hides, bone, horn, and eventually milk and wool in later developments. Wild boar can exploit human waste and disturbed environments, making them candidates for closer association, though pigs remain difficult in their own ways. Aurochs are powerful and dangerous, yet their descendants become cattle, one of the most consequential domestic animals in history. None of this happens instantly. The earlier stages are hard to see because bones do not always reveal whether an animal was hunted, wild, managed loosely, or bred under human control. Scholars still debate the details at many sites, and the evidence remains incomplete. Animal domestication requires a different kind of attention from plant cultivation. Seeds can be stored, sown, and selected with relative quiet. Animals move, resist flea fight, breed, sicken, and die in visible ways. To manage them, people must interfere with reproduction, movement, and survival. They must decide which animals live long enough to breed and which are killed young. This creates patterns in bones. A managed herd may show an age and sex profile different from a purely hunted population with many young males slaughtered, while females are kept longer for breeding. Changes in body size can appear over generations as human selection and controlled breeding alter the animals themselves. But these signals develop gradually. Early management may leave ambiguous traces. A group might hunt a local herd, intensively protect some animals from predators, drive them seasonally, or control access to water without fully domesticating them. The boundary is again a broad zone, not a clean line. Climate and settlement both help create that zone. As communities remain longer in one place, their waste-stored foods and disturbed surroundings attract animals. As human populations grow, pressure on wild game increases. As plant cultivation develops crop fields, create new feeding opportunities for animals both wanted and unwanted. Herd animals can convert grass shrubs and marginal lands into meat hides, and later milk, allowing humans to draw food from places not suitable for grain. In a world where rainfall remains uncertain, a mixed economy of crops and animals offers flexibility. But it also adds responsibility. Herds must be watched. Young animals must be protected. Breeding must be managed. Grazing can damage fields or overuse land. Animals can carry disease. They can also become wealth that walks wealth, that can be stolen, exchanged, sacrificed, inherited, or counted. A lesser known but important detail is that domestication changes animals physically and behaviorally, in ways that reveal the depth of human influence. Many domestic animals become smaller than their wild ancestors in early phases. Horn shape may change. Teeth and bones show altered diet and management. Behavior shifts as animals more tolerant of humans survive better in human-controlled environments. Over longer periods, domestication can affect coat color, breeding cycles, and body proportions. But these changes are not simply imposed by human intention. They emerge from a new ecological niche created around settlements, herds, fields, and human preferences. The goat in a managed flock, like the wheat in a cultivated field, is living in an environment shaped by human choice. Domestication is ecology turned inward toward human society. This changing relationship with animals also changes the human body and household. Meat from managed herds may become more predictable than meat from uncertain hunts, but it requires long-term investment. A young animal spared today is food or breeding potential later. That delay resembles the logic of seed saving. The future must be protected from immediate hunger. Herding also changes labor patterns. Children may watch animals near settlement. Adults may move flocks seasonally between grazing areas. Dogs may help guard and direct them. Some members of a community may spend more time away from the village, creating new rhythms between settled fields and mobile pastoral movement. Agriculture does not eliminate mobility. In some places, it reorganizes mobility around animals. The village and the pasture become linked parts of a wider system. The social meaning of animals grows alongside their economic value. A herd can represent survival but also status. Animals can be given in exchange, used in feasts offered in rituals, or displayed as signs of household strength. Cattle in particular later become powerful symbols in many societies, but the roots of that power lie deep in the practical reality that large animals concentrate labour and reproduction, and risk. To own or control animals is to control moving stores of value. This has consequences for inequality, alliance, marriage, debt, and inheritance in later worlds. It would be too simple to project later pastoral wealth back onto the earliest herders, yet the potential is already present. A basket of grain can be hidden in a house. A herd announces itself across the landscape. Animals also bring danger into the heart of settlement. Close contact between humans and animals increases the possibility of disease transmission, especially as communities become larger and more sedentary. The full burden of zoonotic disease grows later with denser villages, towns, and cities, but the foundations are laid when humans begin living closely with domesticated animals, their waste parasites and pathogens. Manure enriches fields, but it also carries risk. Rodents attracted to stored grain bring their own parasites. Pigs near houses disturb refuse. Herds near water sources can contaminate them. The new food systems create new disease environments, and human immune histories begin to change. No single explanation fully accounts for the later rise of epidemic disease, but domestication and settlement are essential parts of that long story. At the same time, animals expand human possibility. They provide hide, sinew, bone, horn, fat meat, and later milk wool traction and transport. Those later developments do not appear all at once, but their eventual consequences are immense. Milk changes diets and even human genetics in some populations, where lactose persistence becomes advantageous. Wool changes clothing and textile economies. Oxen pulling ploughs change the scale of cultivation. Pack animals and riding animals transform distance trade migration and warfare. The first steps towards such changes are humble, uncertain, and local. A goat kept near a settlement does not contain an empire visibly within it. Yet over thousands of years, the human ability to manage animal life will help reshape landscapes from the Fertile Crescent to Europe, Africa, Asia, and beyond. The earliest herders are therefore not simply adding animals to farming, they are entering another partnership full of tension. Plants tie people to fields and seasons. Animals tie them to movement, reproduction, grazing, and watchfulness. Together, crops and herds create a stronger but more demanding system. They can support more people than foraging in many environments, but they require constant labour and expose communities to failure in new ways. A drought can kill crops and weaken herds. A disease can pass through animals. A raid can remove wealth overnight. A field can be replanted, but a breeding herd takes time to rebuild. Security deepens and so does vulnerability. By the time the first agricultural societies take clearer form, the firelight at the edge of camp has widened into a new human world. Dogs linger close. Goats and sheep move under human supervision. Pigs nose around settlement margins. Cattle, still carrying the shadow of their wild ancestors, begin their long transformation into managed power. The event that reshapes human history is not only the moment humans plant seeds, it is also the moment they begin to pull animal lives into the rhythm of human memory, hunger, ritual, and ambition. Around the settlement, the old wild world does not vanish. It presses close watches, resists, adapts. But some of it has crossed the boundary, and once animals begin to live inside human systems, the history of both species changes. The deeper the traces become, the harder the question grows. Why does agriculture begin at all? The answer can seem obvious from the far side of history because the modern world is so thoroughly agricultural that farming feels almost inevitable. Fields feed cities, grain supports states, herds become wealth. Crops can produce more food from a smaller area than many forms of hunting and gathering, at least when conditions are favorable. From a later viewpoint, it is tempting to imagine early humans discovering farming and immediately recognizing it as progress. Yet the evidence refuses that simple story. Early farming often demands more labor than foraging. It can narrow diets. It can tie people to failing land. It can increase disease conflict and social inequality. For many generations, the new way of life may have been less a triumph than a difficult bargain. So the old question remains sharper than it first appears: why would people step into that bargain, and why? Once they stepped in deeply enough, did so many find it hard to step back out? For a long time, one explanation stood above the others: climate stress. A changing climate could push communities toward agriculture by making wild resources less dependable. The Younger Dryas seems to fit this idea well, especially in Southwest Asia. Cooler, drier conditions may have strained semi-settled foragers who were already using wild grains and living close to key resources. If wild stands became less reliable, people may have begun to cultivate more deliberately. If movement became more difficult because communities were attached to place, or because neighboring groups occupied nearby territories, growing food may have become a way to remain. This theory has strength because climate clearly matters. Plants grow where rainfall, temperature, soil, and season allow. Human settlement patterns often change when environments change. The evidence from pollen lake caused plant remains, and settlement shifts shows that the world around these communities was unstable. But climate alone cannot explain everything. Many people experience climate stress without becoming farmers. Many regions warm, cool, dry, and flood without producing agriculture. Something more is needed. Another explanation looks to abundance rather than scarcity. Perhaps agriculture begins not because people are starving, but because certain landscapes are rich enough to allow experimentation. In places where wild grains grow densely, where game is available, where water is dependable, and where communities can stay longer, people have time to observe plant cycles closely. They can gather, store, process, and perhaps sow seeds without immediately abandoning hunting and gathering. In this view, farming grows out of opportunity. A rich environment allows settlement. Settlement encourages storage. Storage encourages future planning, and future planning encourages cultivation. The Natufian world again becomes important because it suggests that some foragers were able to become semi-sedentary before domesticated crops appeared. Abundance, not crisis, may have made the first steps possible. Yet this explanation also has limits. Abundance can support settled foraging without requiring domestication. If wild resources are plentiful, the pressure to cultivate may remain low. Opportunity opens a door, but it does not explain why people walk through it permanently. Population pressure offers another piece of the puzzle. When more people live in a region, the demand for food increases. A mobile foraging system that works well at low population density may become strained as communities grow, territories fill, or movement becomes restricted. Farming can produce more calories from a given area, especially once cultivation intensifies. A group with more children surviving because of stored food and settled life may eventually need more reliable production, which then supports still more people. This creates a feedback loop. More food supports more people, and more people require more food. It is one of the most powerful engines in human history, but population pressure is difficult to prove in deep prehistory. Archaeologists can estimate site numbers, settlement sizes, and occupation intensity, but the numbers remain uncertain, and again, pressure alone is not enough. Some crowded or resource-limited groups respond by moving trading, reducing fertility, changing diet, or intensifying foraging rather than farming. No single explanation fully accounts for the shift. Then there is the social explanation, quieter but increasingly compelling. Farming may not begin only as a response to hunger. It may also be tied to gatherings, feasts, ritual obligations, alliances, and competition between households or groups. To host a feast, a community needs surplus. To maintain a ritual center, people need dependable food. To build alliances, leaders or households may display generosity. Grain and animals become useful not just because they feed bodies, but because they feed social life. A stored harvest can become a festival meal, a debt payment, an offering, or a sign of prestige. Under this view, cultivation may be encouraged by the desire to create surplus for social purposes, not merely to avoid starvation. This does not mean early farmers are already living under chiefs or kings. It means human communities are always social, and food is never only biological. It is memory, obligation, status, belonging, and power. Ritual may have played a role as well. Monumental and ceremonial sites in early Southwest Asia suggest that shared symbolic life could organize labor on a scale once thought impossible before agriculture. At places where people gathered for ceremonies, exchanges, and collective work, the need to feed participants may have encouraged intensified plant use and animal management. Some scholars have even suggested that ritual gathering helped draw people into more settled and productive life ways, rather than farming, simply creating ritual centers after the fact. The evidence remains debated, and it is easy to overstate the case. Still, the possibility is important. Human beings do not change history only because their stomachs demand it. They also change it because their communities imagine meaning, obligation, ancestry, and sacred places. A field may begin partly as a practical answer to hunger, but it may also support ceremonies that make a group feel whole. Another layer lies in accident and unintended consequence. Domestication does not require a conscious plan. People harvesting wild grains may unintentionally select for plants that hold their seeds longer. People discarding seeds near camps may create denser, useful stands. People protecting young animals or hunting selectively may change herd composition over time. People storing food may attract rodents, dogs, and other animals, altering local ecologies. The earliest farmers may not have known they were transforming evolution. They may have thought only of this year's harvest, this year's hunger, this year's ceremony, this year's children. History often changes not when people pursue a grand future, but when repeated small acts accumulate beyond anyone's intention. The evidence for domestication traits appearing gradually supports this slower, more accidental view. The revolution is real, but much of it may have happened while no one was trying to make a revolution. There are also competing regional stories. Agriculture does not begin once and then spread everywhere from a single source. Southwest Asia is crucial for wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, but other centers emerge with different plants and animals. Rice cultivation develops in East Asia under different environmental and cultural conditions. Millet follows another path in northern China. Maize in Mesoamerica emerges from a wild grass ancestor through a long and remarkable transformation. Potatoes and quinoa belong to Andean highland worlds. Crops in Africa follow their own histories shaped by savannas, river systems, seasonal rainfall, and local knowledge. These independent origins weaken any explanation that depends on one climate event alone. They suggest that agriculture is not one invention, but a recurring possibility that appears when certain pressures, opportunities, species, and social conditions meet. The details differ, but the pattern repeats. Humans begin to manage the reproduction of plants and animals more intensively, and life reorganizes around that management. The debate therefore does not end with a single winner. Climate stress matters, abundance matters, population matters, settlement matters, ritual matters, Social competition matters, accident matters, species biology matters. The question is not which factor caused agriculture, as if history were a machine with one hidden lever. The better question is how these forces combined in particular places at particular times. In Southwest Asia, a warming world first creates new opportunities for settlement and wild grain use. Then the younger Dryas brings stress and uncertainty. Communities already attached to place face pressure to secure food more deliberately. Storage gathering ritual and social density make cultivation useful. Gradual selection changes plants. Managed animals enter the system. When warmth returns in the Holocene, the pieces are already in motion. Farming expands not because it is easy, but because it has become entangled with survival memory and society. This is why the event that reshapes human history cannot be reduced to a single moment. It is not one person planting the first seed, not one drought, not one village, not one clever discovery. It is a convergence. The climate shakes the old world. People gather in favoured places. Wild grains invite attention. Animals hover near the human edge. Storage creates a future that must be defended. Ritual and social life demand surplus. Population grows in some regions. Plants and animals begin to evolve inside human systems. Each element alone might have remained temporary. Together they form a trap and a promise. Farming offers control, but it also creates dependence. It provides food, but it demands labour. It supports more people, and those people make farming more necessary. Once this loop tightens, history begins to move differently. The great debate remains alive because the evidence is fragmentary and human life is complex. Archaeologists work from seeds burned by accident bones, broken after meals, pollen trapped in mud walls, collapsed into soil teeth, worn by grit and genetic signals carried silently through generations. They can reconstruct much, but not everything. They can show patterns, but not always motives. Still, the broad truth stands with growing clarity. Agriculture is not a simple upgrade from a lesser life to a better one. It is a profound reorganization forced and invited by a changing world. It begins in uncertainty, grows through habit, and survives because it changes the conditions around it. By the time later people inherit fields, herds, houses, and villages, the choice is already narrowed. The seed has become a system. The system has become society. And society once built around harvest will begin to dream in entirely new ways. The word revolution makes the change sound clean, as if humanity rises from uncertainty into abundance with one decisive turn of the hand. Fields appear, animals gather near villages, grain fills storage bins, and the long hunger of the Ice Age gives way to the security of harvest. That is the version later civilizations prefer to imagine because it flatters the world they inherit. But the first agricultural revolution is not a simple liberation from hardship. It is a trade, and many of its costs are written into bone-tooth soil and settlement. The people who enter farming do gain new powers. They can produce food in larger quantities. They can remain in one place. They can feed more children. They can store surplus against lean seasons. Yet they also step into a narrower and more demanding life. The wild world does not vanish, but the range of daily dependence begins to contract. More labour is poured into fewer foods. More people live closer together. More bodies share waste, smoke parasites and disease. More land must be defended because more survival is tied to it. The event that reshapes human history is therefore not only the birth of agriculture, it is the birth of a new kind of vulnerability. One of the first costs is work. Hunting and gathering can be difficult, dangerous, and uncertain, but early farming often demands repetitive labour on a scale that marks the body. Ground must be prepared with digging sticks, stone hoes, hands and fire. Seeds must be saved instead of eaten. Weeds must be removed. Crops must be watched. Birds, rodents, insects and grazing animals must be kept away. Harvest has to happen quickly when the plants are ready, because the window can be brief, and weather can ruin what months of labour have grown. After harvest comes threshing, winnowing, drying, storage, grinding, cooking and protection from spoilage. These tasks are not occasional. They return with the authority of the seasons. A foraging group may face hunger when resources fail, but farmers face a different pressure, the certainty that food will not exist unless labour is invested long before it is consumed. The future becomes hungry before the present is full. Bones from early farming populations often reveal this new labour through patterns of stress and wear. Though interpretation must be careful, because bodies reflect many influences. Repetitive grinding can affect joints, knees, backs, shoulders and hands. Carrying water fuel harvests children, and building materials wears the body in different ways from a highly mobile hunting life. Teeth may become heavily worn by stone grit introduced during grain grinding. Diets based more heavily on cereals can increase cavities compared with some earlier foraging diets, because starches feed oral bacteria in ways that meat nuts, and many wild foods do not. The evidence remains variable from place to place, and it would be wrong to claim every farmer was less healthy than every forager. But the pattern is strong enough to trouble any simple story of progress. Farming can provide more calories while reducing dietary diversity. It can keep more people alive while making many of those lives physically harder. Diet is another cost. Wild diets are often broad, drawing on many plants and animals across seasons. Early agricultural diets can become more concentrated around a small number of staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, millet, maize, or tubers depending on the region. Staples are powerful because they store and feed many people, but dependence on them creates risk. If the staple fails, hunger follows. If the staple dominates too heavily, nutrition can suffer. Protein, micronutrients and dietary variety may decline unless hunting, gathering, herding, fishing and trade continue to supplement the harvest. In many early farming communities, they do continue because people are practical and do not abandon useful foods just to fit later categories. Still, the centre of gravity shifts. A field of grain can feed a village, but it can also teach a village to depend on rain arriving at the right time, pests staying manageable, and stored food surviving the year. Food becomes more controllable in one sense and more fragile in another. Settlement magnifies the risks. When people live in one place for long periods, waste accumulates. Human refuse, animal, dung, food scraps, damp storage and standing water create attractive environments for insects, rodents and parasites. More permanent houses mean more permanent neighbours, including unwanted ones. Smoke from indoor or semi-enclosed hearths affects lungs and eyes. Water sources near settlements can become contaminated. The closeness of people and animals creates opportunities for pathogens to move between species. The great epidemic diseases of later cities require population densities and connections far beyond the earliest villages, but their deep foundations lie in this new intimacy between humans, animals, waste and stored food. No single explanation fully accounts for the later history of disease, yet agriculture and settlement change the disease landscape profoundly. A community that has gained security from grain may pay for it in fevers, parasites, infections and chronic exposure to smoke and filth that a more mobile camp would have left behind. There is also the cost of numbers. Farming supports population growth partly because stored food and settled life can shorten birth intervals. Mobile foragers often face practical constraints on how many very young children can be carried during movement. Settled communities may support more frequent births, and more children may survive when food storage works. This sounds like success, and in evolutionary terms it can be. More people means a larger community, more labour, more defence, more memory, more hands at harvest. But population growth tightens the trap. Once more people depend on fields, more fields are needed. Once more fields are opened, more labour is required. Once more labour is available, larger harvests can support still more people. A cycle begins in which farming becomes harder to leave, not because it is always better, but because the community has grown beyond what older food systems in that local landscape can support. The harvest feeds the village, and the village becomes captive to the harvest. Inequality also finds new ground in the agricultural world. Not immediately everywhere and not in a single form, but persistently. Stored food can be accumulated. Land improved by labour can be claimed. Herds can reproduce under household control. Houses can vary in size and contents. Tools, ornaments, ritual privileges, and access to storage can become uneven. In mobile societies, wealth is often difficult to accumulate in heavy material form, though social differences certainly can exist. In settled farming communities, durable wealth becomes easier to keep, display, transfer, and inherit. A family with more land, more labour, more animals, or better storage can gain advantages across generations. The evidence for early inequality differs widely between sites, and scholars still debate when and how strong hierarchy appears. But agriculture creates conditions in which inequality can grow roots. Surplus does not automatically make elites, but it gives ambition something to hold. Conflict changes as well. Hunter-gatherer societies can experience violence, and the old myth of a peaceful pre-agricultural world does not survive serious examination. But farming alters what conflict is about. Fields, stores, houses, water sources, and herds are fixed or movable wealth worth defending and worth stealing. Territory becomes more sharply defined where labour has been invested in land. Raiding a storage area can devastate a community. Taking animals can remove years of future reproduction. Burning fields can turn a season's labour into ash. Some early settlements eventually build walls, towers, ditches, or other defences, though the meaning of such features can be debated, and not every wall proves warfare. Still, the logic is clear. As people tie survival to place, the place becomes a target. The promise of security requires the practice of defence. The environment pays a cost too. Early agriculture begins modestly compared with later empires, but even small farming communities alter landscapes. Trees are cut for fuel buildings and fields. Fire is used to clear vegetation. Grazing animals change plant communities and can contribute to erosion if pressure becomes heavy. Repeated cultivation affects soil. Irrigation, where it later develops, can increase productivity, but also create problems of salinity and water control. The first farmers are not modern industrial destroyers, and it would be unfair to judge them by later scales of damage. Yet the relationship has changed. Humans are no longer only moving through ecosystems and shaping them lightly or seasonally. In some regions, they're reorganizing plant and animal life around permanent human needs. The landscape itself begins to carry the marks of dependence, and yet despite these costs, farming spreads and deepens. That fact must be taken seriously. The bargain is harsh, but it is not irrational. Agriculture can produce extraordinary abundance under the right conditions. It can buffer some seasonal shortages. It can support larger communities, richer ritual life, specialized crafts, long-distance exchange, and denser social worlds. It allows people to remain where their ancestors are buried, where houses stand, where paths and memories accumulate. It provides food that can be stored, counted, shared, taxed, offered, and inherited. The very things that make farming dangerous also make it powerful. Dependence creates vulnerability, but it also creates coordination. Labor becomes organized. Time becomes scheduled. Surplus becomes possible. Society becomes heavier, more durable, more ambitious. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that the costs and benefits cannot be separated. More food brings more people, and more people require more food. Settlement brings memory, and memory makes leaving painful. Storage protects against hunger, and storage invites theft and inequality. Animals provide meat and wealth, and animals bring disease and conflict. Fields bring control, and fields create dependence on rain soil and labor. The event that reshapes human history does not rescue humanity from nature. It binds humanity to nature in a new and more demanding contract. The farmer may control the seed more than the forager does, but the farmer is also controlled by the seed's calendar. The village may stand proudly in one place, but it must now survive everything that happens to that place. By the time agriculture becomes established, the older freedom of broad movement has not vanished everywhere, but in farming communities it has narrowed. People can still migrate, abandon villages, return to foraging or mix strategies, and many do. The path is never uniform. But where population, settlement, crops, herds, and memory tighten together, the agricultural world becomes increasingly difficult to undo. The revolution succeeds partly because it creates its own necessity. It feeds the people who must continue it. It multiplies the hands that depend on it. It changes bodies, houses, landscapes, and obligations until a different way of life becomes hard to imagine. Beneath the later grandeur of civilization lies this difficult foundation: sawbacks, worn teeth, stored grain, crowded rooms, watched fields, guarded animals, and the quiet realization that survival has become less wild but not less fragile. As villages grow heavier on the land, they begin to become worlds unto themselves. What starts as a cluster of houses near water-grain animals and memory slowly develops into something more complex, a place with routines, boundaries, obligations, specialists, tensions, ceremonies and histories that belong to the settlement itself. The village is no longer only a practical answer to food. It becomes a container for human life at a new density. Children are born into houses that existed before them. Paths run between doorways because many feet repeat the same journeys every day. Work areas become familiar. Refuse heaps rise at the edges. Storage spaces are guarded, repaired, and remembered. Fields stretch outward from the living centre, while grazing routes, hunting grounds, water sources, and gathering places form a wider ring of dependence around it. A person's world is still larger than the village, but the village now pulls the surrounding landscape into its orbit. This new orbit changes time. In a mobile foraging life, time often follows seasonal movement across a broad territory. In a farming village, time becomes layered around tasks that must happen in place. There is the time of preparing soil, the time of sowing, the time of waiting, the time of weeding, the time of harvest, the time of processing, the time of storage, the time of hunger before the next yield. Herds add their own rhythms: birth, nursing, grazing, slaughter, migration to pasture, protection from predators, management of breeding. Houses add another schedule of repair. Roofs leak, walls crack, floors need resurfacing, hearths fill with ash. Storage pits must be cleaned. The dead must be buried, remembered, perhaps revisited. The result is a society increasingly tied to cycles of maintenance. Civilization, long before it has monuments, begins as the art of keeping things from falling apart. The density of village life also encourages specialization. At first, nearly everyone still participates in food production in some way, because survival depends on shared labor. But as communities grow and surplus becomes possible, some people may devote more time to particular skills: stone tool production, basketry, weaving, bead-making, ritual work, building, herding, healing, or exchange. Much of this specialization is difficult to see because perishable materials vanish. A woven container may have been more important in daily life than a stone blade, but the stone blade survives while the basket becomes soil. Still, traces remain in tools, ornaments, workshop debris, unusual burials, and the movement of materials across distance. Obsidian shells, pigments, fine stone, and later metals travel through networks that connect settlements to one another. Even early villages are not isolated dots. They are nodes in widening webs. Exchange becomes one of the great forces binding these worlds together. A village may lack good stone for blades, but possess grain hides, animals, salt shells, or crafted goods. Another may sit near a volcanic source of obsidian, a material prized for its sharpness and dark, glassy beauty. Another may control access to a spring, a river crossing, or upland grazing. Through exchange, objects move, but so do stories, marriage partners, rituals, songs, diseases, and new techniques. A seed variety that grows well in one valley may be carried to another. A method for building walls may spread. A symbolic design may appear far from its origin. The evidence remains incomplete, but the movement of materials shows that early agricultural communities are already participating in regional worlds. The village is fixed, yet its connections travel. With these connections come new forms of identity. People may begin to think of themselves not only as kin groups or bands moving through a territory, but as members of a particular settlement, house lineage, or ritual community. Architecture helps produce this identity. Houses are not merely shelters, they are social units. In some early Neolithic settlements, houses are rebuilt repeatedly in the same places, suggesting continuity of household memory. In others, dense clusters of buildings show people living close enough that roofs, walls, and courtyards structure daily interaction. The famous settlement of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, later than the earliest farming villages but still part of this deep transformation, shows how dense domestic life can become extraordinary without streets in the later sense, with people entering homes through roofs and living among richly symbolic interiors. Interpretations of such sites remain debated, but they reveal the creative range of early settled societies. The village is not a crude prelude to the city. It is a complex human invention in its own right. Ritual life deepens inside these settled worlds. Painted walls, special buildings, figurine skull treatments, unusual deposits, animal symbolism, and carefully arranged burials all suggest that early farming communities are not concerned only with calories. They are making meaning out of the new conditions of life. Bulls, vultures, leopards, snakes, wild animals, ancestors, houses, and bodies appear in symbolic patterns across different regions, though their meanings cannot be translated with certainty. Scholars still debate whether some objects represent deities, ancestors, protective forces, social identities, teaching tools, or something else entirely. What can be said more safely is that settled life gives ritual a different stage. Ceremonies can return to the same building, the same platform, the same burial, the same wall surface. Memory becomes architectural. Belief gains a place to accumulate. Yet the village world is not only cooperative and symbolic, it is also crowded with friction. When people live close together, small disputes can become enduring ones. Boundaries between households matter. Access to stored food matters. Marriage ties matter. Labor obligations matter. Who helps repair a roof, who joins a harvest, who watches animals, who receives food in scarcity, who controls a ritual space, who claims descent from important ancestors. These questions can shape daily politics long before formal government appears. The evidence for early leadership is often subtle. There may have been respected elders, skilled ritual figures, successful household heads, feast organizers, or people whose control over exchange gave them influence. But power in such communities was likely variable, and negotiated not yet the rigid machinery of later states. Still, the raw materials of political life are present: surplus memory territory, labor obligation, and difference. The environment around villages begins to show cumulative human pressure. Fields expand, perhaps first in small plots and then more widely. Wood is cut for fuel, construction tools, and firing clay. Herds graze surrounding vegetation. Paths harden. Soil is disturbed, enriched, exhausted, or moved. Some settlements may relocate when local resources decline, disease accumulates, or social tensions grow. Others persist by adjusting land use, expanding exchange, or intensifying production. The archaeological record shows cycles of occupation, abandonment, rebuilding, and reorganization. A village is not a static achievement. It is a living negotiation with land. Its success depends on rainfall, soil, fertility, labor, health, social cohesion, and relationships with neighbors. No single explanation fully accounts for why some early settlements flourish, while others fade. Each one balances on its own web of conditions. One of the most consequential changes is that the village makes scale possible. A small farming settlement can become a larger one because food production supports more people than many local foraging systems can. A larger settlement can organize more labor. More labor can build larger structures, clear more land, dig ditches, maintain storage, defend boundaries, host gatherings, and support specialists. Specialists can improve tools, ritual objects, exchange goods, and social coordination. These improvements can increase productivity or prestige, drawing still more people. The process is uneven and often reversible, but the direction matters. Human groups begin to experience life in larger, more permanent concentrations. Once that becomes possible, the later town is no longer unimaginable. The village also changes human imagination. When people live inside a built environment made by their own community, they experience the world differently. Walls, floors, storage bins, pens, paths, and fields are human decisions made visible. The landscape becomes partly ancestral and partly engineered. Children grow up surrounded by evidence that people can reshape the earth and that the reshaped earth can outlast them. This may be one of the deepest legacies of early settlement. It teaches humans to expect permanence, even when permanence is always fragile. It teaches them that labor can be stored in architecture, food, land, and animals. It teaches them that tomorrow can be planned, counted, and defended. By the time villages become worlds, the event that began in climate instability has moved far beyond climate. The shock of environmental change helped open the path, but now social momentum carries the transformation forward. The harvest demands coordination. Storage demands rules. Houses demand inheritance or memory. Herds demand movement and ownership. Ritual demands gathering. Exchange demands trust and obligation beyond the settlement. Children born into this world inherit farming not as an experiment but as normal life. They may still hear stories of wider movement, wild abundance, old hunting places, and lands beyond the fields, but their daily reality is shaped by walls, crops, animals, and neighbors. The village has become the center from which history expands. It is still small compared with later cities, still vulnerable, still close to the wild. But within it are the basic ingredients of civilization, surplus specialization, social memory, territory, ritual inequality, exchange, and the disciplined labor of many people living by the same turning seasons. The dead do not speak, but they leave behind a record that is sometimes more honest than memory. Long after houses collapse, fields disappear, and names vanish beyond recovery, the body remains in fragments, carrying evidence of food, labor, disease, ancestry, migration, violence, and change. A tooth can hold the chemistry of childhood water. A bone can preserve the strain of repeated work. A seed burned by accident can reveal what people planted, gathered, stored, or ate. Pollen sealed in mud can show whether forest-spread grasses retreated, or fields opened under human pressure. Charcoal can mark fire, whether natural or deliberate. Ancient DNA, when it survives, can trace movements of people, animals and plants across landscapes where no written record exists. The event that reshaped human history is therefore not reconstructed from one kind of evidence, but from a scattered archive hidden in soil, skeletons, hearths, tools, sediments, and genes. It is a story pieced together from things no one intended to preserve. Bones are among the most intimate witnesses. They show that the shift toward farming changed human bodies in measurable ways, though not always uniformly and not everywhere at the same pace. In some early farming communities, skeletons show signs of repetitive strain, joint stress, and injuries linked to heavy daily work. Grinding grain, carrying loads, digging soil, building houses, hauling water, and managing animals leave patterns that can be read carefully, though never perfectly. Bones also reveal stature growth, stress, trauma, and disease. Some early farming populations show reduced average stature or signs of nutritional stress compared with some foraging groups, but the pattern varies by region and period. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be misleading to turn it into a simple rule that all farmers were less healthy than all hunter-gatherers. Still, the skeletal record makes one point difficult to avoid. Agriculture changed the terms under which bodies lived. Worked, healed, and failed. Teeth sharpen the picture. Human teeth preserve evidence of diet in ways that are both ordinary and profound. Heavy reliance on starchy crops can increase dental caries because carbohydrates encourage bacteria that produce acids damaging to enamel. Grinding grain with stone tools can introduce tiny mineral particles into flour, causing teeth to wear down over years of chewing. Tooth enamel can also preserve chemical signatures from childhood, allowing researchers to infer aspects of diet and movement. Stable isotopes in bones and teeth can indicate whether people ate more animal protein, marine foods, millet maize, wheat, or other staples depending on the region and chemical pathway involved. These methods require caution because diet is complex and signals overlap, but they have transformed the study of early farming. They allow the dead to reveal not just that they lived in a village, but what kind of food world entered their bodies. Plant remains tell another part of the story. Most plants decay quickly, so the survival of ancient seeds often depends on accident. A storage pit burns, a hearth chars spilled grain, a house fire preserves what ordinary rot would erase. These charred remains can be identified by specialists who distinguish wild and domestic traits, measure seed shape, and compare changes over time. In Southwest Asia, the gradual appearance of non-shattering cereals helps show domestication unfolding not as a single moment but as a long process. In other regions, rice grains, maize cobs, millet seeds, squash rind, beans, tubers, and other remains reveal different pathways into agriculture. The record is patchy because preservation favors some environments over others. Dry caves, waterlogged sites, and burned settlements preserve different kinds of evidence. What survives in the record suggests not one agricultural revolution, but many local experiments in which people gradually become entangled with particular plants. Pollen and microscopic plant traces widen the view from food to landscape. Pollen grains settle in lakes, wetlands, and soils, creating layered records of vegetation over time. By studying those layers, researchers can see forests expand or shrink. Grasses increase, weeds associated with disturbance appear, and cultivated landscapes spread. Phytoliths, tiny silica bodies formed in some plants, can survive, where pollen does not, offering clues about grasses, crops, and plant processing. Starch grains trapped on tools or in dental calculus can identify foods that might otherwise vanish completely. These microscopic clues are easy to overlook because they lack the drama of a skull or a stone monument, but they are among the most powerful witnesses to the agricultural transition. They show that human history is not only written in objects made by hands, it is also written in the dust of plants. Animal bones reveal the transformation from hunting to herding with equal subtlety. A pile of bones can show which species were eaten, what ages they were killed, whether males or females were favoured, whether body size changed over generations, and whether butchery patterns suggest hunting management or domestic life. In wild hunting, the age and sex of prey may follow the opportunities of pursuit. In managed herds, humans often slaughter young males, while preserving more females for reproduction, creating a distinctive demographic pattern. Over time, domestic animals may become smaller, less robust, or morphologically different from their wild ancestors. Horn cores, tooth wear, and bone measurements can all speak. Yet early management remains difficult to interpret. A community may heavily hunt a local gazelle population, loosely manage wild sheep, or fully herd goats in ways that overlap archaeologically. Scholars still debate many details, especially in transitional periods where the line between wild and domestic is blurred. Ancient DNA has added a new and sometimes startling layer to this evidence. Genetic studies can trace the ancestry of crops, animals, and people, showing where domestication likely began, how domestic lineages spread, and how farming populations moved or mixed with local foragers. In Europe, for example, genetic evidence has shown that farming did not spread only as an idea passed from neighbour to neighbour. People descended from early farming populations also migrated, mixing with hunter-gatherers in complex patterns. In other regions, the balance between migration, adoption, exchange, and local development differs. Ancient DNA has corrected older assumptions, but it does not solve everything. DNA survives unevenly, especially in warm and wet climates, and genetic ancestry does not map neatly onto language, identity, or culture. A person's genes can move one way, while tools, crops, and rituals move another. The evidence is powerful, but it must be read alongside archaeology, not above it. The dead also leave signs of violence and care. Some skeletons show trauma from blows, projectiles, or conflict. Others show healed injuries, meaning people survived with support from their communities. A badly injured person who lives for years after trauma reveals social care more clearly than any tool. Burials can show tenderness, ritual identity, or status, though interpretation remains uncertain. Grave goods may suggest difference, but they do not translate easily into rank. A richly adorned burial might belong to someone powerful, beloved, unusual, feared, or symbolically important in ways modern categories cannot capture. Some graves hold children with ornaments, complicating assumptions about achieved status. Some bodies are buried under houses, some in cemeteries, some manipulated after death. The dead leave clues, but they do not surrender their meanings easily. This is the strange beauty of archaeological evidence. It is both intimate and incomplete. It can show that a person ate more grain than meat, suffered from infection, grew up in one geological region, and died in another, performed repetitive labour, carried certain ancestry, or lived among domesticated animals. But it cannot fully restore the person's voice, fear, humour, grief, or private memory. It can show that a village stored food, rebuilt houses, exchanged obsidian-buried ancestors, and cultivated plants. But it cannot fully recover every argument, ceremony, kindness, or betrayal inside those walls. No single explanation fully accounts for the agricultural transformation, because the evidence is not one clean document. It is a broken archive, and every fragment must be placed carefully against the others. Yet the fragments converge. Bones show changing bodies, teeth show changing diets, seeds show changing plants, animal remains show changing relationships with herds, pollen shows changing landscapes, tools show changing labour, houses show changing settlement. DNA shows changing populations and lineages. Together they reveal that the event reshaping human history is not a myth of sudden progress, nor a simple tragedy of lost freedom. It is a deep reorganization of life visible at every scale, from microscopic starch grains to continental migrations. The soil remembers what people forgot. It remembers fields where forests once stood, animals bred under human selection bodies, worn by new labour, and settlements where the living and the dead shared the same ground. And from those quiet remains a larger image emerges, humanity crossing a threshold so slowly that no generation sees the whole crossing, yet so completely that the world on the other side becomes almost unrecognisable. From the first fields and herds, the road to civilization is not straight, not smooth, and not guaranteed. Many early villages rise, change, and disappear without ever becoming towns. Some farming communities remain small for centuries. Some return to more mobile ways when conditions shift. Some blend cultivation with hunting, fishing, herding, gathering, and exchange so thoroughly that no simple label fits them. Yet a new possibility has entered the world, and once it exists, it can grow in scale. Agriculture allows more food to be concentrated in particular places. Concentrated food allows more people to live together. More people create more labour, more conflict, more cooperation, more memory, and more need for coordination. At first, this coordination may be local and informal, shaped by households, elders, kin groups, ritual specialists, skilled workers, and seasonal obligation. But over time, in some landscapes, the village begins to exceed itself. The settlement becomes larger than face-to-face memory can easily manage. The harvest becomes bigger than one household can store. The irrigation ditch, the defensive wall, the ritual centre, the exchange route, and the granary all begin to ask the same quiet question: who organises the work and who controls what it produces? This question lies near the heart of the long movement from fields to civilizations. The earliest farmers do not set out to create states. They do not imagine scribes bending over clay tablets, kings claiming divine favour, armies marching in ranks, or tax collectors measuring grain. But the practices that make those later worlds possible begin much earlier. A stored harvest can be counted. A counted harvest can be divided. A divided harvest can be owed. An owed harvest can become tribute, rent, tax, debt, or offering. The material nature of grain matters here. Grain is durable, divisible, portable enough to move, and storable enough to accumulate. It can feed workers who are not producing food directly. It can support builders, potters, guards, priests, traders, administrators, and rulers. It can be locked away. It can be redistributed. It can be seized. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of complex societies, but stored food gives power a body. In the great river valleys and fertile lowlands where later civilizations arise, agriculture becomes tied to water control. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates create a landscape of opportunity and risk. Water can bring fertility, but too much or too little can ruin fields. Irrigation allows cultivation on a larger scale, yet it demands maintenance, labor coordination, and decisions about access. Canals silt up, banks break. Fields need drainage. Salts can accumulate in soil when irrigation is poorly balanced, slowly weakening productivity. These are not merely technical problems, they are social problems. A canal system links households and communities into shared dependence. The farmer upstream and the farmer downstream are no longer separate in the same way. Water becomes a matter of negotiation, authority, timing, and sometimes coercion. The field pulls society into administration long before administration becomes formal government. The Nile Valley follows a different rhythm shaped by the annual flood that renews the soil, with a regularity unusual in much of the ancient world. That regularity helps support dense farming communities, and eventually one of history's most enduring states. Yet even there, agriculture is not simply a gift of nature. Floods must be observed, fields, organized labor, mobilized grain, stored and surplus directed toward temples, elites, workers and armies. In the Indus region, cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro later show another path with urban planning, drainage, craft specialization, long-distance trade, and still debated political organization. In China, millet and rice farming support increasingly complex societies along river systems, where flood-lower soil, seasonal rainfall, and labor organization create their own historical pressures. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, maize, beans, squash potatoes, quinoa, and other crops help sustain civilizations that develop without the same animals, landscapes or river patterns found in Afro-Eurasia. The story repeats, but never identically. Agriculture is a foundation, not a script. What changes everywhere it takes root deeply is scale. A farming village can support potters whose vessels improve storage and cooking. It can support builders who create stronger houses, walls, platforms, and eventually monumental structures. It can support ritual specialists who spend more time maintaining ceremonies, calendars, ancestors, and sacred spaces. It can support traders who move obsidian shells, metals, stones, textiles, salt pigments, and food across distance. It can support conflict specialists, whether guards, raiders, warriors, or leaders whose influence grows during crisis. Specialization does not appear because people suddenly become more intelligent. It appears because food production, storage, and social organization allow some people to spend more of their lives doing work other than finding daily calories. This is one of agriculture's most consequential effects. It separates at least partly the production of food from the production of everything else. Writing eventually emerges from this world of storage, exchange, ritual, and administration. It is often imagined as born from poetry or philosophy, but some of the earliest writing systems are deeply practical. In Mesopotamia, marks on clay develop within a world concerned with accounting, goods, labor rations, offerings, and ownership. Before literature, there are lists. Before epic, there are tokens, seals, and records. This should not make writing seem less extraordinary. It makes it more revealing. The first written signs show that civilization is not built only on imagination but on management. Grain must be tracked, animals must be counted, workers must be fed, temples must receive goods, debts must be remembered beyond the trust of a spoken promise. Writing gives memory an external body just as storage gives food a durable one. Together they allow authority to extend beyond the immediate presence of a person. The rise of cities intensifies the transformation. A city is not merely a large village. It is a different kind of organism. It draws food from surrounding fields and villages. It concentrates specialists, administrators, craftspeople, ritual institutions, markets, and power. It requires roads, canals, storehouses, rules, and systems of exchange. It creates anonymity on a scale villages rarely do. It allows strangers to live near one another under shared institutions rather than only kinship. It produces wealth, beauty, invention, poverty, hierarchy, and dependence in new forms. The city is a brilliant and dangerous child of agriculture. Without fields and herds, feeding people beyond the immediate household cities cannot sustain themselves for long. Without stored surplus, monumental labor becomes nearly impossible. Without administrative systems, dense populations become difficult to govern. The city is harvest-made architectural, but this same growth brings the shadow of collapse. The first civilizations inherit agriculture's vulnerabilities and enlarge them. Drought can become famine across a region. Irrigation can damage soil. Crop disease can spread. Trade routes can fail. Inequality can harden. Rulers can demand too much labor. Wars can destroy fields and canals. Climate shift can weaken systems that seemed permanent. A village may scatter when hardship comes. A city can suffer catastrophically because it depends on flows of food, water, labor, and authority from many directions. The grandeur of early civilization therefore rests on a fragile base. The same surplus that builds temples can be exhausted. The same administration that coordinates labor can become oppressive. The same walls that protect a city can trap hunger inside. Scholars still debate the causes of many ancient collapses because no single explanation fully accounts for them. Yet again and again, the deep structure is agricultural dependence stretched to a complex scale. From the viewpoint of deep time, the first states are astonishingly recent. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings live without them. Then, after agriculture takes hold in key regions, the tempo changes. Populations rise, settlements expand, technologies accumulate, trade networks lengthen, social hierarchies become more visible. God's ancestors, rulers, laws, property debt, and labor obligations become woven into food systems. This does not mean agriculture automatically creates oppression, or civilization automatically destroys older freedoms. The truth is more complicated. Farming communities produce tenderness, artistry, ritual beauty, and remarkable resilience. Cities produce knowledge, engineering, literature, and forms of cooperation that would be impossible in smaller groups. But they also produce deeper inequality, organized violence, and systems that can compel labor on a scale unknown in earlier life. The harvest feeds both the child and the king. The event that reshaped human history therefore continues to unfold long after the first seed is planted. It moves from the hand gathering grain to the village storing it, from the village to the town, from the town to the city, from the city to the state, from the state to the written record that later generations mistake for the beginning of history itself. But history did not begin with writing. Writing began when older histories of soil, seed, animal, water, and settlement had already transformed the human world. The first scribes did not stand at the dawn. They stood after a long, mostly silent revolution had already remade the conditions of life. Beneath their tablets lay thousands of years of experiment, hardship, adaptation, and memory. Beneath the city lay the village. Beneath the village lay the camp. Beneath the camp lay the Ice Age world with its moving herds, drowned coasts, and people who did not know their descendants would one day count the harvest and call it civilization. For all that agriculture creates, it also covers something over. Beneath the fields, roads, villages, and later cities lies an older human world that does not vanish everywhere at once, but is gradually pushed to margins absorbed, transformed, or forgotten by the people who inherit the written record. The story of farming often becomes the story told by farming societies about themselves, and such societies tend to remember their own rise as necessity, improvement, or destiny. They build temples over old ground-cut canals through ancient wetlands, plough soils that once held seasonal camps, and name landscapes according to crops, borders, estates, and rulers. The mobile worlds that came before leave fewer monuments and fewer durable claims. Their knowledge is carried in bodies' roots, songs, tools, habits, and memories, bound to places that later maps may not even preserve. When those worlds disappear, they often disappear quietly, not because they were empty, but because the forms in which they stored memory were more vulnerable to time. One of the greatest losses is geographic. The end of the Ice Age raises the seas and drowns vast territories where people once lived, travelled, fished, hunted, gathered, and perhaps told the first stories about changing water. Around the edges of continents, plains become seabeds, river valleys become estuaries, forests sink beneath waves, campsites vanish under silt. Burial grounds, if they existed near old shores, are scattered or buried beyond ordinary reach. Between Britain and Europe, the lowlands often called Doggerland gradually disappear beneath the North Sea, taking with them a whole inhabited landscape of rivers, wetlands, animals, and human movement. Around Southeast Asia, the exposed lands of Sundaland shrink as seas rise, reshaping the human geography of islands and coasts. In the Persian Gulf basin, on continental shelves along ancient river mouths, countless human places now lie underwater or have been destroyed by waves. The evidence remains incomplete, not because people were absent, but because the archive has been drowned. This matters deeply because coasts and river mouths are often rich places for human life. They offer fish, shellfish, birds, reeds, edible plants, fresh water, transport routes, and access to both land and sea. If many late Ice Age and early Holocene communities lived near such environments, then modern archaeology sees the past through a damaged window. Inland sites survive more often. Caves, rock shelters, and dry uplands preserve better than shifting shorelines. This can make human history appear more inland, more stone-centered, or more fragmentary than it really was. A fishing net made from fibre, a wooden canoe, a basket of shellfish, a reed mat, a coastal shrine, a child's footprint in tidal mud, all may vanish without leaving the kind of trace that survives 10,000 years. What is lost is not only land, it is proportion. The human past becomes distorted by the survival of some materials and the disappearance of others. Another loss is ecological. The world before agriculture is filled with animals that later humans will know only through bones, paintings, stories, or not at all. The great megafauna of the late Pleistocene disappear in many regions through a complex combination of climate change, habitat shifts, human hunting pressure, and other ecological factors. Scholars still debate the balance of causes from place to place, and no single explanation fully accounts for every extinction. In some regions, climate seems especially important. In others, the arrival or expansion of human hunters appears closely linked to losses. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, enormous beavers, giant kangaroos, and many other species vanish from different landscapes. Their disappearance changes not only the view, but the functioning of ecosystems. Large animals shape vegetation, move nutrients, disturb soil, open paths, spread seeds, and create habitats for other species. When they go, the land itself behaves differently. For human communities, the loss of these animals is also a loss of knowledge. To hunt or avoid a giant animal requires generations of attention. People would have known migration routes, danger signs, seasonal behavior, anatomy, fat cycles, preferred plants, and the meanings of tracks left after rain. They may have built ritual stories and identities around such animals. When a species disappears, the knowledge tied to it begins to lose its object. It may survive for a while in myth art or metaphor, but eventually it becomes detached from direct experience. Later agricultural people may plough through ground where mammoths once moved and never know the full world beneath them. The field is not only a new ecosystem, it is a landscape of forgetting. The spread of farming also changes the fate of hunter-gatherer societies. In some regions, farmers expand into territories used by foragers, bringing crops, animals, diseases, new technologies, and larger populations. Sometimes the relationship includes exchange marriage, borrowing, and coexistence. Sometimes it includes displacement, conflict, absorption, or marginalization. The genetic record in several parts of the world shows mixture between expanding farming populations and local foragers, but also replacement in some areas and long persistence in others. Culture does not move in only one way. Foragers adopt crops without becoming identical to farmers. Farmers adopt local knowledge from foragers. Boundaries remain porous for centuries. The evidence remains regional and complex, but the broad consequence is clear as agricultural populations grow older. Mobile ways of life often face increasing pressure. The world becomes more crowded with fields, yet it would be wrong to speak of hunter-gatherers only as remnants or survivors of a vanished past. Many foraging societies continue to thrive long after farming appears, especially in environments where agriculture is difficult, unnecessary, or less efficient than wild resource use. Arctic regions, deserts, tropical forests, coasts, wetlands, and grasslands can support lifeways that do not fit the agricultural model. Some groups choose not to farm because their existing systems work. Others mix strategies depending on season trade and political pressure. The idea that farming is the inevitable destiny of all intelligent people is a farming society's prejudice, not a law of history. What is lost when agriculture dominates is not intelligence or progress on one side and backwardness on the other. What is lost is diversity in ways of being human. That diversity includes different concepts of property, time, wealth, labour, and obligation. A mobile society may value portable knowledge more than stored goods. It may measure richness in relationships, territory, access, ritual knowledge, or skill, rather than in grain bins and herds. It may organize leadership differently, resist accumulation, share food, according to rules that prevent one person from becoming too powerful, or move away from conflict before it hardens into institutions. This does not mean mobile societies are automatically peaceful or equal. No human form deserves romantic simplification, but they often preserve possibilities that agricultural states later suppress or forget: lighter, material life, flexible movement, deep ecological literacy, and social systems less dependent on permanent surplus. When farming becomes dominant, these possibilities do not vanish from human capacity, but they become harder for large societies to imagine. There is also a loss in attention. Foragers must know many species intimately. They must read subtle changes in weather, animal movement, plant growth, water, soil, and season across broad landscapes. Farmers also possess deep knowledge, but it is increasingly concentrated around managed species and fields. As crops and domestic animals become central, other forms of ecological knowledge may narrow. A farmer knows wheat, barley, rice, maize, cattle, goats, soil, and rain with extraordinary seriousness, but may no longer need to know the full range of wild foods once used by ancestors. The surrounding wild becomes less a complete pantry and more a boundary, a threat, a pasture, a hunting reserve, a sacred grove, or unused land waiting to be cleared. human attention begins to divide the world into useful, tame, wild, and waste. That division has consequences that continue into the present. Some losses are impossible to measure because they concern stories. Before writing, memory lives through performance, repetition, image, landscape, and teaching. Mobile people carry maps in narrative form, attach meaning to hills, rivers, trees, animal crossings, stars, and seasonal camps. When movement ends or territories are lost, the story system attached to those movements can weaken. When seas rise over coastal plains, the roots disappear. When fields replace grassland, the old animal stories lose their tracks. When farming populations absorb foragers, some stories survive transformed. Others fade because the conditions that made them necessary no longer exist. Archaeology may find a hearth, but not the tale told beside it. It may find ochre, but not the song. It may find a burial, but not the name. And still the older world does not entirely disappear. It remains inside the agricultural world in disguised forms. Farmers still forage wild greens, hunt animals, gather honeyfish rivers, collect medicinal plants, and read weather signs. Ritual calendars preserve older seasonal sensitivities. Myths remember floods, animals, ancestral wanderings, sacred mountains, and lost lands. Tools retain ancient forms. Dogs sleep near human homes as descendants of a bond older than farming. Fields themselves depend on knowledge that began with foragers watching plants through many seasons. Even the act of saving seed carries an older attentiveness to the life cycles of wild grasses. Agriculture does not replace the past completely. It builds over it, borrows from it, and sometimes pretends it has surpassed what it still secretly uses. The event that reshapes human history therefore creates both a future and a shadow. It makes possible villages, cities, writing states, science, literature, law, architecture, and the dense networks of the modern world. But it also helps bury landscapes, lifeways, species, and knowledge systems that had sustained humanity for almost all its existence. What was lost cannot be reduced to nostalgia. It includes real hardship, danger, and uncertainty, but also freedom, skill, diversity, and intimacy with living landscapes. The agricultural world grows by narrowing human dependence around selected plants and animals, then expanding that narrowed system across the earth. In doing so, it changes not only what people eat, but what they remember. Beneath every field lies an older map. Beneath every city lies a place where people once knew the land differently. And beneath the story civilization tells about itself lies a quieter story of drowned coasts, vanished herds, abandoned paths, and knowledge that left almost no ruins because it was carried in living minds. The event still lives inside the modern world, though it is easy to miss because it has become ordinary. It is present in the bread on a table, the rice in a bowl, the cattle in a pasture, the fences dividing land, the calendar built around work and storage, the tax records of states, the crowded streets of cities, and the quiet assumption that most humans should live in fixed places fed by fields beyond their walls. The ancient climate shock has long passed. The younger Dryas is no longer felt as cold wind over a Natufian village or as drought tightening around wild grain. The glaciers have retreated, coastlines have redrawn themselves, and the Holocene world has carried human societies into scales the first cultivators could never have imagined. Yet the response to that old instability remains everywhere. People learn to hold food closer. They learn to reshape plants and animals. They learn to settle, store, count, defend, inherit, and expand. In doing so, they created the foundations of the world that now seems natural. The deepest legacy is dependence. Modern humanity depends on a remarkably small number of domesticated plants and animals, descendants of ancient experiments carried forward through millennia of selection, migration, trade, conquest and breeding, wheat, rice, maize, barley, potatoes, soybeans, millet, sorghum, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, and a few other species support billions of lives. This is one of the most astonishing achievements in the human story, but also one of its great vulnerabilities. Diversity exists, and local food systems remain varied, yet the global food structure rests heavily on selected crops and managed animals. The old broad forager knowledge of hundreds of edible species has not vanished everywhere, but it has been pushed far from the centre of most societies. The modern supermarket, for all its abundance, is the distant heir of a narrowing that began when people chose certain seeds, guarded certain animals, and built life around their reproduction. That dependence also changes power. Once food can be grown, stored, counted, and transported, it can be controlled. The first grain stores eventually lead to temples, palaces, treasuries, warehouses, markets, and states. The connection is not simple or automatic, but it is persistent. Agricultural surplus allows some people to command the labour of others. It supports administrators, warriors, priests, nobles, merchants, builders, and rulers. It makes possible the concentration of wealth in ways difficult for many mobile societies to sustain. Later history is filled with struggles over land-water harvests, rents, tribute taxes, and labour obligations. Empires expand not only for glory, belief, or security, but for fields, irrigation systems, pasture, and the people who work them. The plough and the sword are never as separate as civilization likes to pretend. Beneath written law and royal ceremony lies the basic question of who controls food. Disease, too, carries the imprint of this transformation. Dense settlements, close contact with domesticated animals, stored grain, attracting rodents, contaminated water, and expanding trade networks all help create new environments for pathogens. The earliest villages do not yet produce the vast epidemics of later cities, but they begin the long rearrangement of human immunity and exposure. Over time, as populations grow larger and more connected, diseases can persist, spread, and return in waves. Human history becomes partly the history of microbes travelling along the same routes as grain livestock merchants, armies, and migrants. Scholars still debate the precise origins and pathways of many diseases, and no single explanation fully accounts for the complexity of human pathogen relationships, but agriculture and settlement are central to the story. The village gives humans new security from starvation in some seasons, while opening new doors to illness. The ancient transition also shapes inequality between regions. The availability of domesticable plants and animals is not evenly distributed across the planet. Some regions contain wild species more easily drawn into agriculture and herding. Others contain abundant resources but fewer candidates for domestication, or environments where farming offers little advantage. Later history magnifies these differences through migration exchange, conquest, colonization, disease technology, and state formation. It would be wrong to reduce global history to geography alone, and scholars still debate the weight of different causes. Culture, choice, violence, ecology, and chance all matter. Yet the early unevenness of agriculture becomes one of the deep foundations beneath later unequal power. Some societies develop dense populations, stored surplus writing, metalworking armies, and states earlier than others, not because their people are more capable, but because particular crops, animals, climates, and historical circumstances allow certain systems to intensify sooner. Even ideas of time and work still carry the agricultural imprint. The planting season, the harvest season, the stored surplus, the debt to be paid, the land to be inherited, the boundary to be defended, the calendar to be followed. These shape how societies imagine responsibility and future. Industrial life appears far removed from early fields, yet it inherits agriculture's discipline of scheduled labour and delayed return. Modern economies still depend on planning across seasons, years, and generations. Insurance, taxation, wages, property law, supply chains, and national reserves are distant descendants of older concerns: how to survive uncertainty, how to store enough, how to distribute it, and who has authority over the store. The first people saving seed against hunger could not know that their practical restraint would echo into accounting systems, bureaucracies, and global markets. Still, the line exists. The future becomes a managed space when food is saved for it. The environment bears the longest and widest mark. Agriculture transforms forests into fields, wetlands into managed basins, grasslands into pasture rivers, into irrigation systems, and wild plant communities into crop landscapes. At first, the changes are local. Over thousands of years, they become planetary. Domesticated species travel far beyond their original ranges. Forests fall to farming frontiers. Soils are enriched, exhausted, terraced, drained, flooded, and eroded. Animals bred under human control become some of the most numerous large vertebrates on Earth. The modern climate crisis is not caused by the first farmers in any simple sense, and it would be absurd to place industrial responsibility on Neolithic villages. But the first agricultural transition begins a new relationship between human society and Earth systems. People no longer adapt only by moving through environments. They increasingly adapt by remaking them. That power grows slowly, then enormously, and yet the legacy is not only danger. Agriculture also makes possible some of the most extraordinary achievements of human life. Larger communities preserve knowledge across generations in new ways. Surplus supports crafts, music, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, law, literature and philosophy. Cities become places of invention, memory and exchange. Written records allow voices from thousands of years ago to cross time, however unevenly, and often through the perspectives of the powerful. Temples, observatories, libraries, canals, poems, roads, ships and schools all emerge from worlds sustained by food production. The same system that creates inequality also makes new forms of cooperation possible. The same stored grain that feeds soldiers can feed builders, healers, artists, and children through winter. The agricultural inheritance is therefore morally mixed, as most human inheritances are. It is not a fall from paradise, and it is not a simple ascent into progress. It is a transformation that multiplies both human possibility and human risk. Inside the human body, the event continues more quietly. Diets, immune systems, gut microbes, genetic adaptations and diseases all reflect long relationships with domesticated foods and settled life. In some populations, the ability to digest milk into adulthood spreads under the influence of dairying. In others, adaptations to starch-rich diets, high-altitude farming, local pathogens, or pastoral life shape biological history in subtler ways. Culture changes genes, and genes then affect culture in return. This is one of the most profound lessons of the agricultural transition. Humans are not separate from the systems they create. They build fields, then fields reshape their bodies. They keep animals, then animals reshape disease and diet. They settle in villages, then villages reshape birth, labor status, and memory. The maker is remade by the thing made. The old event also survives in modern anxiety. Every drought, crop failure, livestock disease, supply shock, or grain shortage reveals that civilization still rests on harvests. The technologies have changed almost beyond recognition. Satellites watch rainfall. Machines harvest fields. Global trade moves food across oceans. Laboratories sequence plant genomes. Governments calculate reserves. Yet the ancient dependency remains. Seeds must germinate, water must arrive, soil must hold. Pollinators, climate, labour, storage, transport and peace must align well enough for food to reach mouths. The modern world may seem distant from a small settlement, watching wild grain ripen after the younger Dryas, but both are bound by the same truth. Human society is built around the fragile conversion of sunlight, water, soil, plant life, animal life, and labour into survival. This is why the event that reshaped human history cannot be left in prehistory as if it is finished. It is still unfolding. Every city is a late expression of the first village. Every written law about property carries the shadow of land becoming inheritable. Every border drawn across farmland echoes the old narrowing of territory around food. Every market selling grain, every political crisis over bread, every migration caused by drought, every technological effort to improve crops, every argument over land use belongs to the same long aftermath. The Ice Age ended, but the human answer to its instability became permanent. Faced with a world that changed faster than the inherited memory could bear, people began to make food more predictable. In doing so, they made society more complex, more powerful, more unequal, more inventive, more crowded, more vulnerable, and more enduring. What remains most striking is that no one saw the whole transformation as it happened. No child in an early village understood that a grinding stone, a storage pit, a handful of saved seed, and a goat watched near the settlement edge would lead towards cities, states, empires, factories, and a planet altered by human appetite. Each generation made choices within its own uncertainty. Stay a little longer, gather more seed, save some for later, protect the patch, keep the young animal, repair the house, bury the dead near home, return after the rains. The world changed through these small acts until the small acts became a system, and the system became history. The event still inside us is not a single disaster or invention, but the moment humanity began to answer instability by building permanence. That answer gave people civilization. It also gave civilization its oldest fear that the ground beneath it can change again. The fields are quiet now in the long view of time. The first hands that gathered wild grain have vanished beyond memory. The houses they repaired have fallen back into earth. The paths between their hearths, storage pits, graves, and gathering grounds have blurred into layers of soil that only patient excavation can read. Yet something of their world remains not in their names, because those are gone, and not in their voices, because no writing preserved them, but in the shape of human life that followed. They stood inside uncertainty between a fading ice age and an unfamiliar warmth between the freedom of movement and the pull of place between the wild abundance of the old world and the anxious promise of food held close. They did not know they were changing history. They were simply trying to live. Across thousands of years that effort widened. A saved seed became a harvest became a store became a village became a town, then a city, then a state with laws, debts, ceremonies, soldiers and scribes. The change was never pure. It carried hunger and security together, beauty and burden together, invention and loss together. It gave humans bread, walls, calendars, ancestors beneath floors, songs for planting feasts after harvest, and the power to remain in one place long enough for memory to thicken. It also gave them crowded rooms, worn bones, guarded borders, unequal stores, and the fear that rain might fail. The old landscapes are mostly gone. Some lie beneath farms, some lie beneath cities, some lie beneath seas that rose after the ice melted. Beneath the North Sea, beneath coastal shells, beneath river mud and desert dust, there are missing worlds, where people once watched animals move gathered plants by season, and new places that no map now names. Their knowledge did not disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was carried in living minds, and living minds are fragile vessels against deep time. Still, the story has not ended. Every meal is part of its aftermath. Every field is a memory of that ancient bargain. Every city rests on the same quiet hope that food can be made dependable for one more season. And somewhere beneath all the machinery markets, roads, and lights of the present, the first question remains almost unchanged. How does a human community survive when the world begins to shift beneath it? The answer once was to follow, then it became to stay. And between those two ways of living, history changed direction.